Church at the end of 2024. Is $200 billion really not that much for a global church? Could the LDS Church really end world hunger with its resources? These questions and more we'll explore this evening on Mormonism Live. Was that supposed to be people applauding?
Those were people applauding. Did you not hear it?
No, to me it sounded like a million voices crying out together at once and suddenly going silent.
Oh, it sounded pretty normal on my end. So folks, you can let us know how that sounded for you.
Yes, how did that sound for you?
Yeah, please.
But anyway, it's great to be here. It's Wednesday night. It's Mormonism Live. How are you, Mr. Reel?
I am doing so good, Mr. Radio Free Mormon. How are you?
I am fine, except for the fact that I had this whole script written out to read right when the show started. And you said, okay, we're going to go live in 3, 2, 1. And then I thought, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be reading the script.
Yeah. And you might have even started it just a second ago. There's this thing, right? We have to go live and then we got to wait a short moment for it to show up. And you've got maybe a different screen open or something. So maybe you don't catch exactly when that happens. And we sort of have to guess at it. But here we are. And it is January 22nd, 2025. And you're in charge this week. You've got a great episode for us. And I'm excited for the show tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I am too, because the good people at the Widow's Mite Report have released a year-end summary for 2024, and it covers a number of interesting things. And we were fortunate enough to be able to get a professor of accounting to come on the show with us. And I'm speaking, of course, of Spencer Anderson from Indiana University. Professor Anderson, welcome aboard.
Welcome. Thanks. It's nice to be back.
Well, it's great to have you. You know, without going into detail, I tell you what, I'll withdraw that question, okay? It has to do with you and your involvement in Widow's Mite and what it might or might not be. And all of a sudden I thought, why am I even going there? Let's instead, but you are familiar with the report, the year-end report from 2024 that the Widow's Mite put out?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's why we had you on here, so you can explain it to us. Can you tell our audience, for any of them who don't know, in a thumbnail version, what the Widow's Mite report is?
Sure. Yeah. So it's an organization, I suppose, a grassroots sort of organization of members and current and former members, active and inactive, from a variety of different professions. So you've got people from law and from finance and from accounting that all kind of joined together and have tried to compile all of the public information that's available about the church and regarding its finances, and create estimates surrounding the church's wealth, the church's spending, the church's income, all of those things that maybe a lot of people would demand if they could from the church, just general disclosure. And the goal is not to necessarily change the church's behavior or to force members or non-members to think a certain way about the church. It's more about just presenting the facts and letting the facts speak for themselves. Everybody in the Widow's Mite that's on the official team has decided to remain anonymous. And so that's why I'm here.
That's why you're here.
We're all beneficiaries of their information. And then you have to listen to me because they're anonymous. So,
right. Did you have something you were going to say, Bill?
No, I love these things we do where on this side of things, we keep the church a layer away from knowing things, just like they've spent a 200 years keeping us sort of a layer away from knowing things. And it sort of makes the conversation, I think, much more interesting. So I'd love to know what those Widow Mite folks have come up with.
Well, they've come up with a lot, and they have a number of reports on their website, which is, I believe, the Widow's Mite. You can just Google it and it'll come right up. We got a number of reports. They're all listed there. The most recent one is the one we'll be going over tonight. And I wanted to address first Professor Anderson, or if I may call you Spencer.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Please do.
The one thing I want to address is that this consortium of individuals, the Widows Mite people, had no goal of changing the behavior of the church. That's not what this was about, as in traditional activism, perhaps. And yet, is it not true that the recent increases in humanitarian aid announced by the church that date back to the inception of the Widows Mite report, though not demonstrable, might very well have something to do with the churches upping their humanitarian aid?
Yeah, we'll see this in a minute. But anytime there's a big discontinuity around a certain event, around a very short period of time, you can usually look at and kind of see like what that event was that might have precipitated that change. And we'll see that in a few slides today. It's an immense, I mean, you think about the type of impact you might be able to have on the world. And these anonymous folks have made a huge impact on the world. So, we'll get into the numbers behind it, but it is astounding to me. Like I see these people as heroes for sure.
That is great. Let me put this up here. So here is the cover of the Widows Mite report. You can see it's titled "A Report on the State of Wealth in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." It's 31 pages long. And here is the first page, which says that this report summarizes their estimates and analysis of the LDS Church finances for 2024. And you can go back to the 3 times they've done this prior to it in years 21, 22, and 23. And they've got links there that you can click.
Can I add something? RFM,
yeah, please
sorry.
do. Please do. I'm sorry. I just figured this was so boring. I was trying to breeze through it.
No, but if people want to access the Widows Mite, there's a new website. So you can just go to thewidowsmite.org. But then also they've added a YouTube channel that adds accessibility. So like you can sort of listen in on the report. It gives captions or whatever. And then there's also a new Instagram page for Widows Mite. So there are lots of different ways to kind of find it. And, I think that when it's like on its own website, it can be kind of hard to find. And so now it's kind of branching out and it's in the places where you already are. So just wanted to kind of share that because I think that people could easily find a lot of this information on their own.
Do you have any information about how well viewed this 2024 update or analysis or summary is that we're going to be going through?
There's always the same sort of, we're going to talk a little bit about the misconceptions thing. And so there was a little bit of back and forth in terms of like, what are some of the misconceptions about both the church and the Widows Mite that we keep seeing in just the public sphere? And a lot of those are addressed in this 2024 report. I think that's the part that people maybe like the most out of the report. And, I'm going to kind of give some clarification about like where some of the estimates are more estimate based, let's say, and where maybe we should put maybe most of our confidence. And so, it's not as though these are like hard numbers. None of this is they weren't able to kind of sneak into the Ensign Peak boardroom and find exactly what the financial report said. And so this is an estimate, but we are going to talk a little bit about like what goes into those estimates and where those estimates are good and where those estimates are even better. So what I will say though is that I can't think of, there's not an estimate out there or a conglomerate of estimates out there that approaches anything close to what is being provided here. And so any of like the criticisms that come across just fall really flat. And you'll notice that, a lot of like apologists for the church, they tend to not actually push against the estimate itself because there's nothing to push against. If the Widows Mite group like were to get corrected, for example, you could always email them. There's on the website, there's an email. You could say something like, oh, well, I found this information, you're actually wrong. And the Widows Mite would immediately correct itself. So it's not as though like there's any way for anybody to, I don't know, slam dunk on the Widows Mite and its efforts because it's just after truth. There's just, there's nothing, there's no other motivation behind it. So I don't know if that makes sense, but like, yeah, there are some misconceptions. There are always these criticisms that people are just, that the report is out to get people. But I've also found that like there have been times where anti sort of like critics of the church have pushed against Widow's Mite and said that they're biased. And then there are times when there are, faithful members of the church that have pushed back on Widow's Mite and said that they're biased. And so I think if you get on both sides that some criticisms, it's probably a good sign that you're on the right track. So.
Well put. Now, why don't you just tell me when you'd like me to advance the slide?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Sorry. I just, I forgot to mention the website. Go ahead.
I'm glad you did.
Can keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about this. Like the goals are just transparency. And one of the things that I think that they realized with the Widow's Mite team was that even though that information is out there and it's public, most of that information is not voluntarily disclosed by the church. And so what you end up having is the information is in so many different disparate sources that it's really hard to accumulate all of that and then to impound all of that into what would be like a price or a valuation. And so with this expertise, like, a lot of us don't have this kind of expertise to be able to put this all together and create the kind of estimates that are being created here. And so that's kind of part of the reason why the Widow's Mite exist as well, is anybody could technically, with enough time and effort, could replicate everything that's done here, but it's really hard to do that if you don't have the expertise. And so I think that was maybe all I wanted to say on this one.
Okay.
Let me
well,
open
these are the
this up.
sources that were used.
Right. So like I mentioned, there are a ton of different sources that are provided. Most of these are not provided voluntarily by the church, but you have regulations and laws that maybe force it. So for example, you have statements on financial policy that have been made in the past. Maybe you have statistics related to church assets. Some of those are offered by the church. So you have like the meeting house locator and things like that sort of tell you where you can find chapels, and you can use things like that. The charity reports that the church uses, you can kind of parse through that and back into some of the estimates. Even the ones that they don't provide, you can sort of, there's some language behind the scenes that if you just kind of do the Sudoku, you can kind of figure out what it is they're really saying. BYU has audited financial statements. I don't know how many people know that, but because they get federal support, they have to be audited, and those audited reports are publicly available. And then there are some federal state financial filings for things like, well, it depends on the country, but in the United States, you have the 13F filings and things like that as well. And there have been some previously leaked documents as well. So we think about the whistleblower report, but I think that the Widow's Mite does not want you to send confidential data to the Widow's Mite. If you happen to have confidential data and you want to expose the church or whatever, go to the right source and be a whistleblower. Don't take it to the Widow's Mite because they don't want to get in any mess with, legal mess with all of that. So anything else? I don't know if there's anything else that maybe we should discuss. They have access to a lot of the analyst tools like Bloomberg, S&P Capital IQ, things like that. So.
Can I just acknowledge, and I want to say I appreciate it. There's a super chat contest going on in the chat, and I just want to say thank you to each of you. So it started off with a $5, and it said the super chat amount to beat the King of the Hill ain't no knocking me down. Well, somebody came in with $5.01. Guy, I win. $9.99. Shannon M. I'm competitive. Michael, $50. Let's make this interesting. And then Swanee Speed Ramsey said, I'm in, $99.99. And so I just want to say thank you to those who helped support the show. So thank you so much.
And the great thing is, because I'm in charge of the show tonight, that means that all that money's mine.
Yeah, that's it, RFM.
That's how we do it. I mean, that's it. That's our understanding, isn't it?
Yeah, yep.
Since this evening?
Yep.
That accelerated way too quickly. It went from like 5 to 50. It should have gone.
And now it's 100. So hopefully
Oh, wow. Geez.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Please don't don't knock yourselves out or anything. Don't run faster than you have strength. Or is that walk faster than you have strength or whatever? Here we go. What's this page about?
So this is one of the estimates that I think actually you can rely pretty heavily on. And that is that as of the end of 2024, the estimate for the church's investment portfolio at Ensign Peak is now, all of the investment for-profit assets under Ensign Peak are now worth an estimated $206 billion. And, it's so hard to put context around those numbers, right? So if you look at the beginning of 2019, for example, that was only 6 years ago, and it's basically doubled since then. And back then, that was when everything kind of started to get exposed, was around 2020, and it was a large amount then, and it's since at least the beginning of 2019, it's around doubled from there. So it's just kind of astounding. You can kind of see the trend. It's nothing's holding them back at this point.
Can I just say, the interest you make on investing, whatever it is, it's not 200%. What I'm trying to get to is that back 10 years ago, 2015, there's somewhere around 75 billion, 80 billion. And they've been able over the course of 10 years to get it to 206 billion. What that essentially means is, yes, they're making money on their investments for sure, but they're also having a lot of leftover money each year to put into investing. Rather than utilize it, there's a lot more money coming in than going out.
It's the power of compound interest for sure at work here. And, the market's had a good run as well. And so I don't necessarily think that you'd always see this trend over a 10-year period. But in fact, we'll talk a little bit later that they actually could have beat this number by quite a bit with a different strategies. But either way, they've just grown by so much. It's crazy.
All right. So 206 billion, and going to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay. So, when we try and break out the actual $206 billion figure, one of the things that's difficult is kind of figuring out where all of this is going, or where it would be. How did we even get there? Right. So how did you get to a $206 billion figure? And the way that the Widow's Mite does this, it's important to realize that there are some things that they have full information about. There are some things that they have limited disclosure over. And then there are some things that aren't disclosed by the church at all. And so the one thing that we do have to kind of set us on the right foot is the whistleblower report. The whistleblower report gives an idea of what the proportional amount of each type of asset is as part of the strategic portfolio of Ensign Peak. And so, for example, one of the strategies that's mentioned in the whistleblower report is 26 to 31% of the total assets under Ensign Peak would be these U.S. stocks, basically these 13F stocks. And so based on that information, we can then back into some valuation estimate. And you can do that in one of a couple of ways. You can start off with the original estimate that we already have of each of these asset classes, and then track those asset classes over time using market benchmarks, sort of saying okay, well, what's the average return on bonds and fixed income securities and hybrid securities and real estate over time? And then, project out how much each of those asset classes would be worth today. And another way to do that is to just say, well, if we assume that 26 to 31% of the total assets is going to be 13F stocks, well, we can take the value of the 13F stocks today based on the now public reports that the church has to provide. And then you can sort of back into what the 100% of the assets must be worth. And both of those ways reconcile quite well. If you go back in time, you try and go back into the whistleblower report, or if you look back and track with BYU documents, audited documents that they have to provide. So for example, the BYU and affiliates documents, you try and do the estimate without using that report. And then when you go back and you look at the audited statements, you can see that it tracks really well. Same with court filings that have been recently submitted by the church where they reference church wealth. So in all of these cases, as time goes on, there's the chance that these estimates diverge from the real number, right? Because the anchor that we have is mostly the whistleblower report. But because it's still tracking so well.
That was from 2019, correct?
Correct. So because that tracks so well right now still, I think that people should put a lot of confidence into this. And somebody asked, is the 206 billion for the whole church? No, it's just the for-profit investments. So 206 billion of just for-profit investments. We'll talk a little bit about the other part of the church, the church part of the church, after this part. So,
okay.
Anyway, I don't know if there were any questions here, but
did you have any, Bill?
No, I don't have any questions.
Well, what I'm understanding, I don't know if it's a question, but I'll make it one by saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are different models for using these partial pieces of information to answer the questions that the widow's mite is trying to answer, specifically how much and how is it diversified. And
yes.
that these different models, even though they approach the information in a different angle, they end up reconciling pretty close to the same answer.
That's right. Yep. And not only the same answer, but they reconcile with whenever we do get some hint at what the church might be worth or what some piece of the church might be worth, it always reconciles really well within a couple percentage points. So it's great. So far, the models are working well.
Yes. So that really strengthens the conclusion.
Correct.
Okay, great. I just wanted to underscore that. Obviously, you can't prove it, but it strengthens it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so if there was an estimate maybe to rely on, this one would be, I think, one that you could rely on quite heavily. And to any extent that anybody doesn't believe me or doesn't think that it is reliable, then go and find your own estimate and come up with your own numbers and try and debate on this, right? And so, but what we've seen so far is that nobody has been able to do that, right? And so then, the motivation of the Widow's Mite team ends up getting criticized instead.
I just want to note, the church could be transparent with its finances, and it could resolve the problem by clearly laying out the evidence of what it actually does have. And so all we're left with is highly educated guesses at best. And you guys are doing a hell of a job doing it. And then I also just want to note, there's several people in the chat who are asking, is the 206 billion everything the church owns, or is this only their investment arm? And if I'm not mistaken, this is just the investment arm. This does not include businesses or land holdings or any of that.
No. So, let me clarify that. Thanks for that question. So when we say investment arm, we just mean all of their for-profit investments, which could include land holdings, real estate, businesses, private ventures, anything that's sort of you would think of as like a for-profit entity or endeavors. Those would all be included under this $206 billion. And so it's not just stocks and bonds, if that makes sense. It's all of the things that we would think of that are not ecclesiastical. Is that the right word? Ecclesiastical, church related, I guess. Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
So can you help me here? Because I was thinking about it wrong until you started saying it does include real estate in the 206 billion, but that's investment real estate as opposed to churches and universities and temples.
That's right.
Okay. Well, now I guess I understand.
Yeah. I mean, Ensign Peak, the whole reason that Ensign Peak was created was to kind of put all of the for-profit pieces of the church under one umbrella. So the goal of Ensign Peak and everything that we're trying to, to value here is related to its for-profit endeavors. So yeah, so as you can see, like private equity, that's listed under here. You can see that real estate in the yellow on this figure.
Oh yes,
might be kind of hard to see. The yellow highlighted figure says real estate. So those are all included as well. So we would include those. Now, if it's like a welfare farm, like if it's something that's just done for humanitarian purposes or for religion purposes, those would not be included here.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Okay, so then and another way to think of this is like you have its operating assets, the church's operating assets. Those are the church parts of the church. That would include things like the BYU system, the welfare farms, like I mentioned, chapels and temples, things like that. Our estimate for operating assets for all of those, church-related assets is 87 billion. Okay. So 206 billion of for-profit investment assets and 86 billion or 87 billion of operating assets. So in other words, a lot of people would kind of interpret this as we have an $87 billion church, and then there is an investment auxiliary to the church that is 206 billion.
Okay. So the 87 billion, so I'm looking at the far right column out of the three.
That's
the
right.
tallest one. It's 293 billion. And that is, however, the green one, that's the 206 billion that we just got done talking about, right?
That's right.
206 billion. That's all the investments that the church has in EPA. And then
That's
this
right.
87 billion is the estimated value of all the church associated buildings and property.
That's right.
Okay, because of course the church owns those too. So
Yes.
put them all together, and what have you got? $293 billion.
Yeah.
more
So
or
you've
less.
got basically a $300 billion church, 2/3 of which, or a little more, is just for profit, basically endeavors. I will say that there are some things that are more difficult with valuing some of the operating assets of the church. So things like chapels and temples, and knowing like what the replacement costs. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but like valuing some buildings can be very difficult. And from an accounting perspective, I don't know how much you guys care about this, but from an accounting perspective, there are lots of different measurement bases that you could use and you could employ. You could try and estimate what the cost was for them originally to create this. You could adjust it for inflation. You could try and do a replacement cost, like how much would it cost for them to build a new building today and tear down the old one? You could say like, well, how much would the market pay for this building nowadays? And so you have to go through like these different estimates, essentially. So it's not too hard to find the buildings. It's more about estimating the value of each building, which is really difficult. And so I think that Widow's Mite team would recommend you place a little less weight on the 87 billion and this is the best reliable estimate we can get. But there's probably a greater width of potential reason, a reasonable range around that. That's probably a little wider than the 206 billion figure. I don't know if that makes sense or if I explained it well, but
I understood
both
that they're
Yeah.
a little more hesitant on their valuation of the church property, which is 87 billion. So that's a little squishier, but they're
That's
pretty sure about the 206 billion in the investments.
Squishy. That's a good word for it. Yeah. It's a little squishier.
Is that an accounting word?
I don't know.
What was that
It
thing
is
about
now. I'm going to start adopting it.
do the Sudoku? What does that mean?
Oh, do the Sudoku. So like when, the humanitarian, have you ever done Sudoku?
I know the Sudoku puzzle.
Okay, right. Sudoku
Okay.
puzzle.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is that if you go back through like the humanitarian reports of the church, sometimes they'll reveal like one figure and then they'll stop revealing that figure in the next period. But they'll reveal two other things that can then allow you to back into the figure that they reported the year before. So you start to kind of like puzzle it all together until you figure out, what it is that the church is trying to really say.
Do the Sudoku.
Yeah.
I love it.
There are two questions that the crowd has that I sort of want to make sure get answered. One is this here. So all the cattle ranches are under the magic cloak of humanitarian assets, not for profit. Do you know the answer to that question?
No. So the answer is not all the cattle ranches are under a cloak of humanitarian aid, but not all are. There's some of both, right? And I would say that probably the vast majority of the land holdings that the church has are investment holdings, not they're for profit. But that's a little bit too strong of a statement to say that all of those cattle ranches are feigning their existence as humanitarian in nature. Now, I've seen some people online that act as though every ranch and every field of agriculture that the church owns is for welfare. They act as though like that is the one purpose. And so it's great that the church holds all this land, but that's just simply not true. The vast majority is for profit. And in fact, in the vast majority of cases that I've seen, at least, the church doesn't even run the farm. They just lease the land. So they buy the land and then they lease it to the farmers, and then they get a return on that investment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So they're not like really in the farming business in a lot of these cases, but they own the land, they own the agricultural field, but they're not the ones that are out there, engaging in the farming behavior, right? So
and I'll just note, we have a Deseret Industries, a DI here in St. George, Utah, right? And that is on the outside looking in, it's like Goodwill. It's a not-for-profit thing. But when everybody brings their clothes and their furniture and their dishware and their games and all the things that get put into a DI, and then you get to then resell those things, that also is making money. Yes, you pay a few employees, but by far, every DI is a profit-making nonprofit venture. I just want to note that. And then the other question somebody has is, does this include international investments? So this $293 billion, is this everything across the globe, or is this just US only? How do you want to answer that?
Yeah, it does include international holdings and international buildings. So it is a global estimate. Obviously, it can be a little more difficult with outside of the United States or outside of certain countries. Actually, there are some countries that are much better at requiring the church to report certain things like tithing receipts. But outside of a lot of countries, it's very difficult to kind of find some of those land holdings or whatever. And so it's possible that there are a few things that are missed here and there, but like this is the best that we can estimate. But yeah, it's a global estimate.
We don't know how much they have invested total in all outside US markets.
We don't know. That's correct. But we can estimate it based on this, the portfolio strategy that was revealed in the whistleblower report, that international stocks represent roughly 9 to 13% of the strategic portfolio proportions of the investment assets.
Okay.
Which, I mean, that's a big deal for the whistleblower, because there are certain forms that you have to file to the IRS if you hold international holdings. And if you don't, the penalty can be quite hefty. And so it would be really nice if the IRS is listening to let us know if that's happening, right? If that's been happening. But I guess we'll see. Maybe we'll see.
Can we just slow that down for a second? That went by me really fast. So what you're saying is that for the international holdings, a company such as EPA has to report that to the IRS. Is there a question about whether they did that?
Yeah. So the whistleblower accuses the church of not filing what are called FBAR. I don't know what the right pronunciation is. It's FBAR, and it stands for Foreign Bank and Financial Accounts or something like that. I don't remember, but it's FBAR. So if you have an FBAR violation with the IRS, essentially what it's like aimed at preventing is you from like sheltering all of your wealth from the United States. And so it's a really easy form. Again, kind of feels a lot like the 13F form, but it's under the purview of the IRS rather than the SEC. And the penalties there have been a lot more FBAR violations in the past as opposed to 13F violations. and the violations have been extremely severe in some cases. So we're talking, like 20% of the portfolio kind of thing.
So if I'm understanding the allegation correctly, during this period of, say, 20 years, when the EPA people were trying to hide the existence of EPA, as well as how much it held, and created all these 13F dummy companies, these shell corporations, in order to hide that, they may also have been not reporting to the IRS for the same reason, to hide the wealth.
That's right. Yeah.
So this has been complained of to the IRS, but we don't know because it's confidential, right?
Yeah, and my understanding is that, well, the IRS is underfunded, and so they have a really hard time with compliance. And so, there's
20% of this portfolio would be worth pursuing.
Potentially, but it's also very costly to pursue these types of things, right? So, I mean, think about the engagement that it would require. So this is always a trade-off for the IRS. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding this where, a lot of times the IRS will go after the 1040, the little people that are filling out a 1040 easy, and they do it the wrong way, because it's really, really easy to audit them and get their $5 that they needed to pay extra, because it's just almost an automatic check, right, within their system. Whereas this kind of thing for the church would require a lot of investigation. So there is this trade-off in terms of return that they're trying to get. What has been found is ever since they cut the IRS's budget, there's a study that has shown that their revenues have gone down. And so it wasn't a good investment for the US government to withhold or cut the IRS's funding.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, and there's no timeline or anything, right? We just
no,
have to
yeah.
wait
So
and
I mean,
wonder.
that's the thing, is like, maybe it'll never happen. Maybe they're just, they might be just strapped for resources. So,
Okay. Well, thanks for bringing that up again. I'm not sure I understood it as clearly as I did just when you explained it. Thank you.
oh. Okay. Is this the next one? Okay. Sorry.
It is.
Having a hard time seeing it, but let me open this up. I'm going to look at it on another screen if you don't mind. Just one
No,
second.
not at all. As long as you can see it, it's page 9.
Okay.
I think what it does is it kind of sort of like the prior slide broke down the $206 billion in investments. I think this has that as a block at the bottom. It's like the sealed portion of the gray plates. And above it, it has the
that's good.
church stuff, the 80 some odd billion.
Yeah. So some of this has some estimation where we don't know the number, and some of this is less estimated. And so, for example, that BYU number, BYU and CES education, some of that includes an estimate because the report that comes from BYU has not been provided yet. And so there are just little things like that are within the numbers here that, like, there will probably be adjustments. Maybe six months from now, you'll see that the numbers on this report will probably change slightly. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? So like the BYU, for example, the BYU report, the team is relying on the 2023 BYU statement, and the 2024 statement hasn't come out. And so there's another one, the humanitarian aid for the church, the giving report that the church usually provides each year. It hasn't come out for the year 2024. And so right now that's an estimate of roughly 430 to 550 million total for, external giving, and 770 to 830 million for fast offerings. And so it's just difficult to kind of know exactly what that number would be. And to be as confident as maybe you would want to be without the report having been divulged. So just kind of as a preface. And then I think that, the main thing to highlight here is, you can see that all the money that has been spent for the most part this year. So on the left-hand side is all the money coming in, and on the right-hand side is where all the money goes. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the source that's required for all of the money that goes out for its operating activities. So you think of like BYU's education programs and building construction for temples and fast offerings and, paying out humanitarian aid and, utilities and buying the Kirtland Temple, all of those things could be paid for without really pulling anything out of the investment portfolio.
Right.
So like, and this has always been sort of the policy, right? Is to not spend more than you bring in. And so this is the problem with the policy is you have this rainy day fund that can never be used because you have a policy that doesn't allow you to use it. I will say though, that this is likely the closest that the church has been to dipping into the investment portfolio for its operations.
It looks pretty close.
That number is so close that it might have already happened. Like, right, where, it's within the margin of error for sure that we might, for the first time since about, 1960 or so, the church might not have run a tithing surplus. This might be the first year since 1960.
Where does all the interest that's generated by the endowment that is this investment fund go to? It just goes on top, right?
It just goes on top. It just gets reinvested over and over again. So every year, basically the typical year, you take all of the returns on your investment, you reinvest them, and then the church also takes any what they call surplus tithing. And so that's anything that they didn't, use for the year. And normally, for the recent history, that's been around $1 billion. $1 billion to $2 billion, and that has also gone into the investment fund. And so the investment fund has just grown by a lot because of that. And then you add on to the fact that they don't have to pay capital gains taxes because they're a religion. And so they sort of have supercharged compound interest as opposed to just the normal compound interest that the Joe Schmoes like you and I have.
Yeah. Is it fair to say their overhead is less than normal?
Less than normal for what?
For having to pay people.
Yeah, I would say so, because you have your service missionaries that are running the ranches and things like that, or Bill mentioned the DI workers, and so and everybody has I don't know how true this is, but everybody has said that maybe the church doesn't pay as well as the rest of the industry. I know that for at least a long time that was the case at BYU. So yeah, I would say that the overhead is probably cheaper. And certainly for things like chapels, the overhead is probably significantly cheaper because, you have, the cleaning expenses you don't have to worry about. Right.
Right.
So there are little things like that where the overhead is definitely not going to be what it normally would be, which just adds to the whole situation that we're in.
And I mean, on top of that, in most of the sectors of employment within the church, they pay below the standard for that position. And in many of these positions, they require you to pay tithing. And some of these, at least at one time, and I think still today, they might even still take tithing off the top themselves rather than put pressure on you to get it and then pay it back. And so by having a lot of volunteers out there, by having folks who are willing to take less pay, whatever it is, 10% less pay, and pay tithing on top of it, the church sort of reduces its overhead costs significantly compared to other private sector businesses.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I've always thought it's super weird. Whoever decides to work at BYU has got to have a very different utility function, is what I would call it, right? They've got to just feel as though they're getting paid in blessings. So
where else do you go if you're a Mormon Egyptologist?
True.
Zing. And here's the next slide.
Okay.
Slide 10.
Okay, slide 10.
Or page 10.
So this is the reason why this bar is gray for 2024. So the other bars are blue, just for people who can't see or just listening. What we're showing here is from 2021 to 2024, there has been an increase in both church welfare. So when we talk about church welfare, we're talking about things like fast offerings and bishop's storehouse. And those are the types of things that are usually contingent on you being a member of the church. And so oftentimes it's paid in the form of fast offerings. It's not paid in the form of tithing. It's not using the investment returns, and it's only to the beneficiaries as a beneficiary for those that are faithful. And so it's sort of like I would almost think of it more like a dividend for like church members. Maybe it's a really small dividend, but some sort of some sort of insurance policy that you get if you're a member of the church, and it's just a really, really, really high premium. And then the benefits aren't great. And so I think most people in the United States can relate to very high premiums and not as good of benefits. And then for the humanitarian aid, for the faith blind giving, if we think about non-church contingent welfare, the amount that from 2021 to 2024 has increased dramatically. And so we can see from like 2021. It was around 108 million total of goods donated, the giving machines and the cash donations, all the way up to now 650 million of outside giving, which is fantastic. I mean, I think that's awesome. I think that the Widows Mite team would love nothing more than for that number to just keep going up. For most of the team, at least. That they would love nothing more than to see that the church is doing really good with the money that exists. And in addition to that, I think that they would like to, two things, right? So I think that they would love to see the church do some amazing things, that transparency sort of has an effect. And then also, I think that the Widows Mite would be ecstatic if they didn't have to exist anymore, because the church started to just report things freely and voluntarily.
Yeah, that's never going to happen. But,
okay. One of those goals is getting close. One of those goals is on its way.
But here's the thing. This is $108 million, okay, in humanitarian aid. That's 2021. This had been pretty even before that, and not as much. Was it around 50 million a year? That's the thing that Elder Holland said a long time ago, or is it Elder Oaks?
I think it was Elder Oaks, but back, I think that it was estimated by, I think it was in 2018. If we go back to 2018, it had gone to, or maybe it was 2019. It had gotten up to around 70 million average per year.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still nothing, right? And so then you see this huge ramping up effect.
108 million in 2021. And I'm reading this for people who can't read it, and also for people who might just be listening to the audio.
Right.
Boy, I'm going to try and do this. Is that $193 million in 2022? Then 500 million in 2023, and a projected because they haven't filed their report yet. Is that 650 million?
That's right.
So in the past 3 years, they've gone up from like 70 million to 650 million. Is that true?
I mean, that's what we're estimating. So that's what they're estimating, the Widows Mite team.
That's phenomenal.
It's great, right? This is, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I can't speak, I guess, for the Widows Mite and whether they have this goal of like, in fact, I could tell you now that there are some members of that team that don't necessarily agree that the church's goal should be to do humanitarian aid. So it's not like some unanimous feeling there. So that, again, there's no goal here to like make the church do certain things with the money, but nobody's going to be sad about it if the church goes and feeds hungry people.
Right.
It's a win-win for the church and for everyone, for the world, right? It's a win-win. So
it does make one wonder why the church hasn't been engaged in this before this, since it's obviously such a win-win.
Yeah. I mean, I have a theory about this. I don't know how much you want to hear about this, RFM, because we talked a little bit about it yesterday, but I think that they're used to the corporate mentality where their responsibility is not to give charitable aid. And if you go back to even currently, a lot of companies are getting a lot of pressure from investors to do more than just try and maximize shareholder wealth. And one of the ways to convince companies to, let's call it, do the right thing, let's say like maybe not pollute the ocean, okay, something like that. One of the ways to sort of insist that this is the right thing to do is to convince the company that they're going to make more money doing the right thing. It's sort of the only way in a lot of ways to sort of motivate a company under the sort of capitalist model that we exist in, to convince them to do things that are right. And so it's interesting, like you said, that now they're ramping up, when if they had sort of done the analysis, the economic analysis, I agree with you. I think that if the church had all along been giving $1 billion a year to charity, to outside charity, and giving as much as they could, and being transparent with its history and its finances, and using missionaries as a service opportunity rather than a proselytizing opportunity, I think that they would have converted more people, and they would have retained more people, and they would have had more tithing receipts, and they would have done more good for the world. And if you're a member, maybe you could perceive it as they would have increased the amount of the Spirit that's felt, I guess, if you want to call it that, across the world. So it's like you said, it's a win-win, and it just makes you wonder why, right? It's kind of interesting that they were just blind to this opportunity. There's nothing wrong with it. There's, even from like the perspective of I think that this money that they've spent could increase the conversions that the church has in the next couple of years. And we'll see if conversions go up relative to prior years. But I do think that, like, if they engage in this strategy and they double down on it, they're just going to get more and more converts.
There's two questions from the crowd. The first one is, are volunteer hour value equivalents included in the charity amounts?
No, but we'll talk about that later. So
okay. We'll
sorry, I don't want to push.
Yeah, no worries. We'll get to that. So great. So, and then, does this humanitarian aid include them acting as the middleman on the Light the World donations? We've talked about this before on the newscast.
It does, right? So
it really isn't. All they're doing is being the middleman. They put a machine out. The machine collects your money. They then give it to pay for the goat in, some other place, and then they get to count it. And this does count in your figures.
Yeah, I think
Correct,
that's on there on the slide.
It is.
Giving
So
machines.
The estimate is quite small. Like, it's actually, for all of the publicity that the giving machines get, it's actually not that much in the grand scheme of things. Like 18 million is the estimate for this last year. The giving machines is an interesting concept, because it's sort of like a website, but instead it's like taking it back in time. And you can think of like a website, like, where you could just say, here are a bunch of charities that you could donate to, and we're going to put it all in one place, one-stop shopping, and you can donate to a bunch of different charities on our website. Well, instead, what they've done is they've just made it less high-tech, and they've put it in a vending machine. And there's just something about, like, the tangibility of it, perhaps, that maybe increases the giving, right? Somebody actually gets like a card, and they get to say that they bought a goat, and they have partners, and, they get Travis Kelce or whatever to talk about it. So maybe with all of that hoopla, you end up getting more donations in the long run. But it's not that you're right. They're the middleman. They're not the ones that are actually, feeding the people.
Their cost is the machines themselves, which aren't that expensive. I mean, they're expensive, but they're not that expensive, relatively speaking. There's a little bit of tech work, right? You have to have somebody who is sort of plots all that out and keeps track of things and whatever. But really, they get all the good PR, and it's really not their money at all. But whoever came up with it, by the way, LDS Church, brilliant move. It's what little cost you put in to get that much good PR every Christmas. Kudos to you.
Yeah, it's sort of like they're like the website designer or whatever. They're like they house it.
Yeah.
And so they facilitate it, and that's great. They also do pay the credit card fee if you choose to not pay the credit card fee yourself when you donate. But so they cover that. But again, you're right. It is an interesting concept for sure. All
right, ready to go to the next slide. Here we are in 11. Oh, the medical school.
As part of like the ramping up effort, BYU announced a medical school. It isn't kind of clear what the timeline is for the medical school at this point, from what I've seen. The BYU has quite a large endowment. So they have an endowment of $3.1 billion, but they also have, like, within their holdings, they have $4.8 billion of investments. And so essentially, like more or less, they have roughly 2 billion extra hanging around in the coffers at BYU. And this is under Ensign Peak's umbrella, right? Because this is the church's school. But that extra 2 billion that's just kind of that's just earning interest and sitting there under BYU's purview, you could think of that as like being able to, the BYU could basically self-fund this new medical school beyond its endowment. They wouldn't even have to dip into their endowment or their pension assets or whatever. So it's just they've got a bunch of money. They've got just a bunch of money sitting around. And so a medical school is something that probably costs a lot of money. And so they could use that. The goal, according to like the LDS Church's statement on the opening of this medical school, is they stated a major focus will be on international health issues affecting members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the church's worldwide humanitarian efforts. So and that's a little bit of a vague statement to me.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. It almost sounds like it's exclusively affecting members of the LDS Church. And I was wondering, what are they talking about? Health issues like cognitive dissonance?
I suffered from that health issue for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. It's murder.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people might be a little bit worried about, there are probably some medical issues that maybe people don't, they feel like the church's principles don't align with. So things like abortion and other sort of reproductive health care, gender type of issues and things like that, right? So transgender surgeries or things like that. Under a medical school, are they going to be required to teach those things? I don't know. I don't know what the answers are to any of those things. That's not my expertise. So
you're right.
It is interesting.
I don't want to get in the weeds, but it is a strange sentence. It sounds like they're saying that there are certain health issues internationally that affect members of the LDS Church, but not other people.
I mean, maybe you could think of the other people as the worldwide humanitarian efforts. I don't know. It's too vague to really parse out, in my opinion. But
yeah,
what's clear is that they do plan on it maybe not being so much about here's a money-making opportunity as much as we think we can do a lot of good in the world is kind of the way that they're pitching it, at least. Mm-hmm. So I always kind of am concerned whenever anybody does any humanitarian aid or gives any aid, and then they've got, their name strapped across the front of their vest or across their face, right? So to what extent is this like, a marketing scheme, essentially, right? To what extent is this a missionary scheme? I guess I go back and forth in terms of whether I care, because I would just like people to be helped in the long run.
Right.
I also believe that if you empower women and you give them the education that they need, that they will lift themselves out of poverty. And in general, that's a great thing for the world. And as they become educated, they could maybe unshackle themselves from the chains of myth that they don't need. And so there could be some even unintended side effects to helping that the church would be providing in terms of like the aid that they would be giving here. I don't know if I was vague enough, but also obvious enough in what I was trying to say there.
It'll be interesting to see the name of that school.
Yeah.
Well, you're no more vague than this sentence from the first presidency. Now, here's the LDS Church humanitarian aid. Oh, the timeline. So this goes back further than that other slide, so we can see the trend.
That's right. So this is the one I really wanted to point out. So if you look at that inflection point, that point that you look at right there, right when the scandals were all coming out and the church's wealth was being revealed, that was when the church decided to suddenly up its spending. And so it would be highly, highly coincidental that they would just be sitting on billions of dollars, and then they would start to ramp up their spending, which, by the way, at this point is still less than 1% of their net worth at this point, right? And so it's not as though, thanks, Colby. That was a Hitchens reference. It's not as though, I don't know. It's just, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. And so I don't want to be engaged in some conspiracy where in my opinion, it would be a conspiracy to suggest that the church like had planned this all along. Instead, the data suggest that as the data started coming out about the church's wealth, the church realized that they had a scandal in their hands. They looked bad, and they started to increase their giving. And that's what's kind of sad about this, is that they've had all this wealth all along, and they didn't just want to do it. They didn't want to give it up, is the way that I'm perceiving this. They didn't try to establish maybe what could have been one of the world's largest charities.
It's like these apostles are doing the opposite of what Jesus said in the New Testament. He says, your good works, do them in private so people don't see. And then you'll be given honor and praise by God, not by people. And they're doing the other thing. What they're trying to do is they're hiding all of their wealth. And then when it becomes known, then they start giving. So they can be seen because they're being seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a confluence of factors that just kind of maybe it's difficult to pull themselves out of that mentality, right? Because first of all, the church itself grew in the 1850s or 1860s during a period when like the world's wealth just started growing exponentially, right when they were settling Utah. And then after that, if you look at like the apostles and the prophets today, they're primarily business people and lawyers. And, they think of things in terms of covenants and in terms of contracts, and they think of things in terms of, well, how do I maximize my wealth? And it's just really hard to picture in our world today a company where the shareholders would want something different than maximizing wealth. It's just barely starting to change on that realm. And so if they're thinking of themselves as the stewards, and they see around themselves that basically every, the whole system has been set up in order for them to, be profitable. You think about like the tax advantages that these religions have, for example. It just makes sense that maybe they would just kind of gravitate towards this without any divine intervention, is what I would have to say would be required in order for Jesus to say, hey, as the primary shareholder, I don't want you to maximize my wealth. I want you to maximize my children's welfare instead.
I guess Jesus hasn't brought that up to any of the leaders.
Yeah, I don't know.
What's really funny?
That would be my interpretation, yes.
What's really funny is it wasn't that long after Russell Nelson became president of the church that in a general conference, he announced, as part of his challenge, right? He announced that he had gone through the topical guide, and every single freaking reference to Jesus underneath all these different names and titles and functions, they go on for pages and pages. He had looked them all up and read them. And somehow he still didn't get the memo.
Yeah, it's a little wild. I mean, you can find maybe a couple of scriptures that would suggest that like God doesn't care about money, but all you need to do is you need to take the two scriptures that say, inasmuch as you've done it unto me, inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. And inasmuch as you've not done it unto the least of these, you've not done it unto me. And that should be everything that you need to know.
Matthew 25, absolutely. That should be everything you need to know. All right. So do we want to go on from this one?
Sure. Yep. I don't think that I guess the other stat maybe from the last one, sorry.
It's all right.
Is that humanitarian aid, just the number behind that. So since the whistleblower came out and this all became visible, humanitarian aid has increased by more than 5 times. So that's the number. And we expect it to keep going up too. Like it doesn't seem as though there's anything stopping it. So
that was a loud whistle. Here we are. Investments still dominate the LDS Church's financial picture.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard to even see it. But if you see, there's like this almost imperceptible little
oh my gosh,
red.
That's the humanitarian aid that they give that they're bragging about.
That's right. Yeah. So this is a rolling 5-year % of income. So that bar, as that 5-year period rolls over, it'll start to incorporate more of these years where like more has been given, right? And so some of that average is like sort of taken. Yes, right. Thank you. You got your.
Looks like somebody cut themselves on the top right of the
Do you
graph.
always have a magnifying glass just sitting around?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I do. Thank you. Just for such occasions. It's red.
Yeah. So, I mean, that number will get that color will get a little larger as time goes on because it is a rolling 5-year average. And so, but that's, that's the number, that's the figure that it is. And so, like, if you were to use a 3-year rolling average, it would be even worse. If you were to just use this last year, which would be maybe even the more accurate way of doing it, it would be quite small as well. So it's not as though this is really, nobody's trying to like sort of misconstrue how much the church is giving here. It's just that the church needs to start giving a little more for a little longer, and then it'll start to get bigger. But this is as a proportion of the church's income. So the church's income has gone up. The church's spending has gone up in almost every category, roughly every category. And you can see that the 2/3 of the church's income that comes in from everything, from all of its sources, tithing, fast offerings, all of its sources, 2/3 of it gets used to just increase its for-profit investment. And then 1/3 of it is used to operate the church. This tiny, tiny little bit right there is the humanitarian aid portion.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, this is just looking at, say, the $7 billion or so that comes into the coffers every year. Is that right?
Yeah, it was a lot more than 7 billion last year, though. It was like
how much was
like,
it last year?
Well, so 7 billion is the tithing
part,
and then you have the investment returns, which I go back.
Oh, and that's the green stuff down there,
right? The investment returns was 24 billion in increased value.
So it's more than 30 billion a year coming in.
More than 30 billion a year coming in.
Money.
And new money.
Oh my gosh! And out of that, they use 1/3 of it to run the church, and then a little bit more for education, a little bit for member welfare, and all this green stuff just goes back into the pot. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
When I spoke about this on the newscast, I don't know if it was this past Monday or the Monday before, maybe, I understood this graph differently. And so I just want to correct myself by letting you correct me, which is I saw the church operations portion getting smaller. I saw the education portion getting smaller. I saw the member welfare portion getting smaller. And I interpreted that as they were cutting cost in those areas, meanwhile making more in investments. But that's not the right way to read that, correct?
Yeah, you can't read it that way just because this is all scaled so that it's proportional on the income each year.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good clarification.
It's fair then to say that they're spending as much or more in church again, certain things affect it. When they cut the janitorial staff, they save tons of money. But generally speaking, they spend as much or more this past year as they did in years past for things like church operations, education, member welfare.
They spent more in roughly every category this last year, than in the year before. Yeah,
good for them. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I mean inflation,
right? So that little nick of a cuticle there, a hangnail.
Yeah,
the humanitarian aid. Am I correct that with this huge thing below it at the bottom, the green, the 2/3 of church income, all this just interest they have bubbling off of the EPA amount and account, that all they'd have to do is go like 1% into that for additional humanitarian aid? How much would that be then?
I'm not sure I understood your question. So if we
increase the humanitarian aid, that little nick up there in the upper right-hand corner, by 1% of the 2/3 of the church income, which is just the interest, and it's going back into the pot.
How much would that be this last year?
They wouldn't even feel it.
No, what he's saying, Spencer, is that they could take just the tiniest bit of that big giant green area, which is the tithing and profits and interest on investments coming in, and they could make that humanitarian aid be significantly bigger without even losing sleep.
Yeah, if my estimate is right, I think it would be an extra. You're putting me on the spot here.
A ballpark is fine. We won't hold you.
$240 million.
I'm sorry. I'm just stunned here because I'm kind of overwhelmed by this graph and this slide, which shows how minuscule the humanitarian aid is of money coming in every year. And then how easy it would be for them to take 1 or 2 or 5 or 10% of this 2/3 of church income, which is just interest anyway, and they're going to put it back in the pot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
But, you know, it's likely that maybe even this year that changed a little bit, right? I mentioned that. And then in years going forward, if humanitarian aid keeps picking up, there's a chance that, you know, they actually start dipping slightly into the returns. Not in any way that's going to change the trajectory, at least in the short-term future, but, you know, enough to just, you know, give something, right, that they could give something more that they could.
Yeah, financially speaking, I get the impression it's like they've escaped the Earth's atmosphere and they're headed to the moon, and now they've come into the moon's atmosphere, and now they're orbiting around the moon. So they've
like they've escaped the gravitational pull.
Yes.
And there's just they're just floating now. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this next one is a surge in announced LDS temple backlog.
Yeah, so the backlog is quite large, as I think people have talked about. It's been breaking ground a lot more in the recent past on temples at a faster pace compared to before. And so there was a lot of, for example, there were a lot of like the backlog of prior construction that has been converted into the dedication in the last year. And so over the next 4 years, it looks as though if you look at sort of ground breakings and things like that, that gap that you'll see between the dedicated temples and the announced temples and the ground broken temples, that gap should come down pretty significantly over the next 4 years. All of that assumes that they won't just ramp up additional announcements at some exponential pace as well.
That's what I was trying to say, that so they're calculating or estimating that the number of the announcements every 6 months is going to go down from what it's been. Is this post Nelson?
Is this post Nelson?
Yeah.
Are we assuming?
Is that what the assumption is? Is that after President Nelson leaves the scene, that maybe they'll stop announcing so many temples?
I don't think they're making any assumption about who's going to be the leader or what their intent or strategy will be, but just that there's a chance that, you know, maybe they've reached the peak of what they, you know, some pinnacle in terms of like what the right number is for temples from their perspective. And at that point, that backlog that currently exists will shrink. As in terms of whether that backlog would increase, I mean, that just depends on whether they want to announce more temples or not. They can make the backlog as big as they want, and it costs them nothing to do so, right? And so they could just make that backlog 20,000 temples if they wanted to. At this rate, though, like the backlog is so large that even if they just didn't announce any more temples, my understanding is that it would still take 8 to 10 years to work through it and close that backlog off. So there's going to be a lot of temple construction, just if you just assume the current pace that the current temples that are announced.
You know, by Nelson, apparently, again, our hunch is always that he's got some beef with Hinckley and he's trying to leave Hinckley sort of in the memory hole of all of the things that he did by doing it bigger or better, getting rid of the name of the church and announcing all the temples. But what he's done is, I mean, at some point, the next leader or the next leader after that, I mean, Oaks won't live long either. And then you've got Holland, and Holland doesn't look like he's in the greatest of health. So then you've got Bednar, but sooner or later, like you say, you can have the giant backlog. The other option is that one of these church leaders, Bednar or whoever, has to go a decade not announcing a temple. And that's going to be a weird thing. If a LDS church president, after all of this constant escalation of temples, suddenly goes his entire tenure going like, well, we're We've announced too many. Where I'm just going to be quiet on temples every 6 months. That'll be strange. So then he's sort of, to keep up with the past guy, he has to keep it up and do it, even if he doesn't do as many. And even if he only announced the normal amount, it would still keep the backlog this big because that's the amount that they can do every year anyway.
Can I give an alternative for a solution, a backdoor for the church here?
Please do. They're watching.
Yes, I hope so. I understand like the incentive to always provide something that's like exciting to keep the members motivated and give them some sense of ownership. You can replace the temple excitement and you can talk about all of the humanitarian aid that you're giving at the end of every conference, right? You could start new initiatives. You could, push for service opportunities. All of those types of things are all really, really exciting announcements that somebody who wants to do good in the world would get behind, and they would ooh and ah over and scream over if they were excited about. So I think that like I agree that like there's this pressure. It's like, man, what are the members going to think if they don't announce something? But all that the next prophet has to do is say, oh, this prophet is going to be the humanitarian aid prophet. And then they don't have to compete with Nelson, and they can also do a ton of good.
Great idea. Hope you're taking notes out there.
Yeah. Who's the next one in line?
Oh my
Elder
gosh.
Oaks. Elder Oaks, if you're watching.
Velocity. It's like I read the slides.
Yeah. So good job reading the slides, RFM. Somebody on the Widow's Mite team referred to this, I believe, as the perpetual motion machine of church money. At this point, it's just making money and there's just no stopping it. And at this point, it probably doesn't even matter how hard they work to spend it. It's just hard to envision the money not compounding to infinity, essentially. That's the power of compound interest, of tax-free compounding interest. So you're just, I don't know. It can be either depressing or exciting, depending on maybe what your perspective. But in either case, unless there's some sort of crazy transformative change to the world that we live in, where either the church changes its strategy, its policy, and it starts to it cancels tithing, or starts paying $5 billion out a year into humanitarian aid extra, or if they start getting taxed, maybe that wouldn't probably even quite do it. If the capital market system that we have, maybe that would be something that could maybe turn this trajectory around. But a lot of the wealth of the stock market relies on this assumption of future growth. And so if somehow growth just sort of comes in on itself, then you could, I guess, see some retrenchment in terms of its value. But these are all either apocalyptic or just extremely unlikely based on what we've seen from church leaders. And so it just seems as though it's not going anywhere. And I don't know if maybe we wanted to talk about what that even shows, but
yeah, go ahead, please.
So the key here is that there's like 70 billion that has been earned in the last 5 years by investment returns. Okay. So the extra money that the church has earned that they didn't have to spend in the last 5 years is 70 billion. And in that 5 years, they've spent 8 billion on temples and humanitarian aid. Sorry, temples, humanitarian aid. Sorry, never mind. Let me make sure I get the stat right. 70 billion is what they've earned beyond what they've spent in the last 5 years. How much would it cost to spend their current 5-year humanitarian aid plus cover all of that temple backlog that we just talked about? It would cost them around $8 billion is all. And so I think that this is important to think about, because a lot of people will say well, the church has all of this money because they've got all of these temples to build. I mean, that's a lot of temples to build. They've got to build all these temples, and it's going to cost a lot of money. It would only cost them $8 billion to pay all of their 5-year humanitarian aid over again, and pay off all of its temple backlog, all of those temples that still haven't been constructed. It's only going to cost them $8 billion to do all of that. So what are they going to do with that extra money? I mean, I don't know if there are ideas out there, but that's a lot of money to just be sitting around. And I don't even know like what they should do with it. Just to give you some more numbers around it. So like it would cost, if they wanted to start over and tear down all of their temples, every existing temple building, and build all the temples that are currently existing, plus all the temples in the backlog. Can you guess how much it would cost to build all of those temples? So that's 366 temples that are either already in operation or announced or under construction. If they had to do that all over again, how much do you think it would cost?
Wow. 100 billion.
Okay. Bill, you got an estimate for people in the chat?
70 billion.
Okay. Yeah, 13.2 billion.
Yeah, nothing.
It's
Compared to
only
what they have.
13 billion to construct all of its temples that it already has and already has announced. So this whole argument that the church needs all of this money for temples, it just falls flat. They have plenty of money plus some, plus 60 billion on top of it, just earned in the last 5 years, in order to do whatever else they want to do with it.
They're paying all their temples out of the new money coming in every year.
Correct. They're not even using the investment fund.
Right. And they're not even using that much of the money that's coming in every year. In fact, I think we had a slide about that. Hang on just a second here, because it was the plates, right? Does that
Yes.
have temples on there?
That's right.
Are there temples on here? The education, building construction.
Yeah, it's in building construction. So
that
with
even
temples
building
and chapels,
sorry,
that would include chapels and temples, 850 to 950 million. So they're spending about $1 billion a year.
$1 billion
total.
a year. Actually, it's a little bit less on all buildings, including temples. So if they're taking in all that money, going back where we were, if I can find it again, right here.
Mm-hmm.
1 billion. So they're taking in around 70 billion over 5 years, and 1 billion is all they would need to pay for their temples. Now, is that 1 billion over 5 years? So would that be really 5 billion?
Yeah. So I don't know, like in terms of like how that translates over to the amount that they spent this year, and they're ramping up right now. And so I don't know, but in terms of, comparing those two charts. But again, like it's just not that much. Like another example is, let's say that it wanted to build 1,000 temples. 1,000 temples, like that would just be immense. That would cost roughly $27.5 billion. So it earned, in addition to what it spent already in the last 5 years, 70 billion. So it has more than enough. Only a third of that, basically, they could build 1,000 temples with.
Well, that pretty much demolishes the argument that they need the EPA fund because they're building temples.
And you know what? It also destroys the argument from the antagonistic side, where critics of the church say things like, well, they're spending money on temples instead of spending money on humanitarian aid, when that isn't the choice in front of the church. The church can do both, and could do both like exponentially
more
to a huge amount. They could do both of these things. They have enough money. So it's a false choice here. There is no choice here. They could do both, or they could do one, or they could do neither, but they have plenty of money. Does that make sense? I guess it's sort of like, there are arguments from both sides.
It so much worse. I mean, I can understand one thing, if you want to build temples instead of, helping out people. I think that's problematic enough. But when you can build 1,000 temples, and you can help people 100 times more than you're helping them, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And you can do it both and still have money left over.
That's right.
That's really hard for me to understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bill, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I was going to add, there was a moment there, I don't know if it was 2008, like the housing crisis, or it was COVID 2020. That's what it was. It was COVID. And the church was getting flack about how much money it had in reserve. And it said something like it was saving this money for a rainy day fund. There was some comment somewhere out there from a church source that said that. And I just want to note that this is a worldwide church. It claims it's the one true church on earth with prophets, seers, and revelators who speak to God for the whole planet if they're listening. Excuse me. Somewhere on planet Earth are people who feel like they are knee deep in the rainy day. There are kids starving to death. There are people suffering severe illnesses because of the quality of water and the lack of food, the lack of health care. To take on an American mindset and go, well, in America, it's not a rainy day yet. We're saving that money for a rainy day is negligent of the world church you claim to be and the effect you could have on people living in the rainy day right now.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Great perspective, Bill. Thank you.
Oh, I opened the phone lines, by the way, 662-667-6667. We've got a few more slides left.
So
you can.
I can go quick. So this has been talked about before in terms of.
No rush to you. I just wanted to give them time to call in and start stacking up some calls so that when we do get to it. So don't feel rushed at all.
Okay. So we've seen this slide before when we talked about, a $1 trillion church is in the near future if things don't change drastically. So within a generation, around 2040 or so, the estimate is 2040 to 2045, 2050, that the church will have there will be $1 trillion church, essentially. But what's interesting about the chart here is right now the church is, if we split up its assets, right? We talked about how you could split it up into the for-profit part and the church part. The for-profit part is currently around 70% of the church as a total.
Right.
And by the time it hits $1 trillion, the estimate is that it will be 83% of the total assets of the church, the for-profit investment part.
And that's because the for-profit investments are increasing in value more rapidly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so this is interesting to me, mostly because it's sort of a philosophical question and also maybe a legal question. I don't know. But at one point you have $1 trillion church, and it's one thing to just have $1 trillion church that's doing a lot of good or whatever. But at what point does $1 trillion church at what point does it stop becoming a church, essentially, right? You have a $200 billion church.
That would be 1997. 1997 is my answer.
Right.
That's when it stops becoming a church. Maybe 1830. Some people would say
1830. Yeah, 1830.
I've heard a lot of comments from faithful members where they say, well, what's the right amount? When will you be happy about how much the church gives, or how much do you want the church to be poor or something like that? And I don't think that's the point. I think that it's just interesting that this, integrated auxiliary of the church is already 70% of the entity. So who's the parent company here and who's the subsidiary?
Oh, good point.
And at some point, you've got to wonder, especially if the money just keeps coming in and doesn't go out of the auxiliary, to what extent this isn't a rainy day fund. This isn't an endowment fund. It's a church that exists as a subsidiary to the investment fund. That's just a very different sort of structure. Now, legally, maybe they don't care, right? Because you're just allowed to have this investment auxiliary. But at some point, I do wonder, even faithful members, they would draw the line at some point and say, yeah, the church is missing. It's immaterial in size to the rest of this for-profit investment fund. And everybody will draw the line somewhere different, right? You maybe draw it somewhere in 1997. Maybe it's $1 billion. Maybe it's 10 billion. But at some point, I kind of got to wonder, if we all don't come to an agreement that it's past that point. So,
yeah, I think that's why this has had such a ripple effect over the last several years, is because there's nobody except for the most ardent, gonna defend this church or die trying kind of Mormon who doesn't see a problem with having this much. And we
Yeah,
may not be able to agree where that line is, but it's certainly past it some time ago.
that's right. I mean, I agree. I agree with you. Yeah.
Thanks. The LDS Church's endowment fund is more capable than ever. Now, when we say the endowment fund, are we talking about the EPA account, the
You
principal?
could, yeah, in principle, we could think of an endowment fund, which is when you have a principal savings and then you take some of the interest from that in order to fund your operations. A lot of universities have an endowment fund. Most universities have an endowment fund. And that's the way it operates, right? So you pull some out, but the principal remains in order to keep growing to some extent, but then
And when you
also so
pull
that
some
you
out,
never just...
sorry, Professor, the disruptive kid in the back row is saying, when you pull some out, though, you mean only pulling out from the interest, right?
Correct. Yeah, you don't want to, because it's an endowment, you don't want to pull it out so that then it disappears eventually. You want it to stay there forever, basically. So the
And this
question
is how
is,
the church is treating the EPA account.
well, it's a little different though, because it's not pulling any money out from interest. So if you go to like Harvard's endowment fund, they're using the endowment fund for their purposes.
But the church has all of this new money coming in.
They're just growing it. Yeah. They're growing it and not using it. So as far as we've been able to see.
And this isn't the first time. We talked about this last time we had you on. The Perpetual Education Fund is the same thing, which is, and they're at least pulling from it. But and maybe folks who are new to the show or watching for the first time, you don't know this. For the believers out there who go to church every Sunday, if you donate, I don't even know if they still have it, but they, under President Hinckley's tenure, they created the Perpetual Education Fund. And the idea that they were taught to you, what you thought you were doing was you donated $10 to the Perpetual Education Fund, and that $10 was given to some poor guy in Puerto Rico to be able to go to college and get a degree, and then he would pay back the $10 with a fair, a reasonable amount of interest. He would get a
Not
savings.
to you. He wouldn't pay the $10 back to you.
He'd pay the loan off.
He'd pay it back to the church.
Yeah, right. But the way it works is that I give $10 to the church for the Perpetual Education Fund. The church sticks the $10 in the Perpetual Education Fund endowment, and then it collects interest off of that. It's probably investing it wherever. It gets interest off of that, and then it takes the interest, loans it to the poor guy in Puerto Rico. He goes to school, gets a degree, gets a job, and then pays back that interest with interest, and then they loan it back out to the next guy. But the original $10 that all the members of the church gave, whatever they gave to the Perpetual Education Fund, that money has never been touched to pay for any kid's college, as far as I know.
Yeah, and so to clarify, I don't have a problem with that. I think that as an accountant, that's a wise, prudent way to go about life.
Except what you
should
don't
be
know,
transparent.
Yeah. Except what you don't know, if I'm not mistaken, the rules of the Perpetual Education Fund is that money has to be held by them for a certain amount of time, and then that money goes back into the coffers. In other words, all the money the people gave to be loaned out to help kids get educated, young adults get educated, kids get educated, that money actually belongs to the church and will never be used for education. It was just a way for them to gain more interest and help people feel good about it.
It's super tithing. It's more money on top of tithing that they're getting.
Yeah. And so what's interesting, I mean, this is even worse though, right? Because the enzyme peak, instead of the interest being used, the interest becomes the new principal. That's sort of the idea.
Yes.
So the principal just every year, because it's not being used. And so it's only going to become a bigger and bigger problem for the church that it has this huge fund. I mean, I call it a problem. I just mean in terms of like, what are we going to do with this kind of problem? So the question is like, would it work? Could the church take its current enzyme peak balance, let's say, and use its principal and then as an endowment fund? And then you only pull out the interest. Could you fund the entire church this way? And the question is like, how much do you pull out? Like, how much could you pull out in interest in an endowment fund? What's the right percentage? So Widows Mite team went to BYU's endowment fund, and they found that they pull out roughly 4.25% of interest every year. So that's the number that was used. I feel like that's a pretty good number to use. It's the church's number that they use in their own endowment fund for BYU.
It's what you would hope to be able to recoup in investment interest for the following year.
Yes, and then some to cover, inflation in the future. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And I just want to note, by the way, starting in 2023, church members who specified the Perpetual Education Fund as a donation recipient on their tithing and other offering slips were told the fund was no longer accepting donations. My understanding went, and again, I don't have a fact for this, so I'll just say allegedly. My understanding was I had a source come to me and say, Bill, this is how it works. This fund got started by President Hinckley, and it had a time limit on it, 20 years, whatever it was. The money on the interest would be loaned out to help educate people. That would be paid back with interest, so interest on top of interest. But the original donations by the people was never part of that. That was just the money that was used to gather the interest that was used. There was an expiration date on the Perpetual Education Fund. I think I was thinking like 20 years, something close to that. And then that money just goes back into the coffers. And what I'm seeing here, at least on Wikipedia, is that actually became true. The fund no longer exists. It's gone.
What if I were to give you a more charitable interpretation of that?
Please, by all means. This is the LDS Church, though, but go ahead.
Okay. The more charitable interpretation is they've got all the money they need in order to perpetually fund their endowment. So they're continuing to make loans, but they don't need any more contributions.
That can be true because you now have enough interest collected that the original money given in donations is no longer needs to even be part of the fund itself.
The reason it's, well, I was going to say the reason it's hard to believe is because it's the same church that's still collecting tithing when it doesn't need to. But then I stopped and I thought, but there's this whole commandment component to tithing that isn't present when you're just asking for donations to a perpetual education fund.
Yeah.
Spencer
and I also,
Anderson. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill. Go ahead.
I'll just fit. My last thing I'll say is they ended it in 2023 in the same time period. That's the front end of them being financially under a microscope. It might benefit them to get out of the way of this before it became more well known how they were operating it.
Okay. What do you think, Spencer?
I mean, I don't see any data that suggests that they shut it down as much as maybe that they just have it all the way funded, maybe. But also, this sounds like a good project for the Widows Mite team to kind of try and see if they can tackle. I don't know where I don't know much about the PEF and like where it would, what status it's in. It is interesting to me, though, that they no longer are accepting donations because there are lots of education opportunities out there, right? BYU Pathways, there are still members that are paying tuition and fees to BYU. So why would the PEF not just keep growing in order to fund more and more people? Like, it seems like there's still a need. So I don't know. Maybe I know that it's primarily for international members. Is that right? That's what I'd heard.
So. I'm not positive, but here we go. So here we get to a number of slides that deal with common misconceptions. We can go through these pretty quick. I know. Misconception number one, Spencer, that $200 billion isn't that much for a global church.
Yeah. So if the church didn't have any more interest, they just pulled it out and stuck it $206 billion under their giant mattress, they could operate for 30 years. That's not even within, that's no interest at all. They just have the cash on hand for 30 years of expenditures. So an example of that, if you were to take the corollary to the average person earning $80,000 a year in the United States, let's say, they would have to pay off their homes and all of their debts and then save 2.2 million up before they started giving to the poor. And then when they started giving to the poor, they would have to give something close to, like $100 a year. I made that last number up, but it would have to be somewhat immaterial to this 2.2 million.
So really, that is a misconception. That $200 billion really is a lot, even for
it's so much.
Church.
It's bigger than it's big enough for them to operate into perpetuity. It's It's far bigger than any other church example that I've ever seen. And in fact, like, there could be some happy medium here. So a lot of churches run on almost nothing, and they just keep giving the money away, and maybe they aren't as financially savvy as they should be, because it is important to be prudent and not lose the building or whatever, right? So in a downturn. So, but this is far and beyond the extreme. 30 years of expenses is three. So if you thought about, like, in terms of like what it could pay 30 years of expenses with just its endowment without interest. If you were to apply that to Yale or Stanford or Harvard, they have around 8 to 10 years of endowment reserves. So that if there were a downturn and they earned a negative return on the stock market, that you do need some cushion there, right? You do need, like, 8 years or something like that, let's say. 30 years is a lot for a church to have in advance. And so if we were to equate this to the number per ward, so let's just think, it's just so hard to like wrap our minds around it. So you have to scale it by something. So we looked at the team looked at the number of wards in 2024, at the end of 2024, that 206 billion, if they were to give it out as like a dividend to wards, right? Let's say that they could just hand it out, $13.4 million per ward. And that comes out to $925,000 per ward in investment profits. So let's just say that they like decided to act like a corporation, like a for-profit corporation.
Oh yeah, and has shareholders.
And they didn't get rid of the 206 billion, right? They kept the endowment fund, but then they decided all of our profits that we earn every year, we're going to give back to the members in investment profits. They could give each ward $925,000 to do whatever they want with. That's what they could do. That's wild to me. You think about all of the needs in every ward. This is beyond like the current spending of fast offerings. And, think about the ward parties that you could have with that, right? It's nuts. That's about $925,000 more than your current ward budget. So I think that's, I don't know how else to describe the numbers. Like a lot of people have tried to kind of conceptualize how much 200 billion is. And this is a $300 billion church. It's 200 billion in just for-profit investments, right? So, okay, that's the first misconception. These misconceptions bother me so bad. There's so many things on social media, especially, where people are just like, with so much confidence, they say things that have no backing in reality, and it drives me nuts.
Well, here's your chance to set the record straight. We're going to skip this little TikTok because I had made a TikTok on the subject for May of 2023. So the what is it? The stats are a little bit older, a year and a half older, but it's the same kind of arithmetic and figuring out the number of years that you can continue to operate. Even
I should have had you do that slide. Sorry, RFM.
No, it's okay. It was terrible.
I know you wanted to move on from the RFM. I have to butt in just one more time.
Okay.
This is the archive for the Perpetual Education Fund. This is the Wayback Machine. This is LDS.org. You can see in the header bar up there, LDS.org/PEF, Perpetual Education Fund /FAC. If you go all the way to the bottom, notice these last three things at the end. All money donated to the fund is used to provide educational loans. None is used for administrative costs. That sounds beautiful. Notice the next two. Contributions and loan payments are added to the corpus or body of the fund. Next one. Only earnings from the corpus are used to provide the loans. The corpus is preserved indefinitely. And so, in other words, it is what I thought it was, which is the fund is not where the loans are made from. The fund is just the endowment that builds a body of money from which interest can be earned, and the interest is then loaned out.
Yeah, but what's the problem with that, Bill? There's nothing wrong with that, is there?
I don't have a problem with that, other than when they sold me on giving my $10, they sold me on giving my $10 so that $10 could go to a kid to get educated. When in reality, 60 cents was going to a kid to get educated, but not from my $10, from the interest earned on my $10, and the $10 went into the pocket of the church itself. Don't tell me that 50 years from now, they can't take that money when no one's looking anymore and use it for whatever the hell they want to, because it will exist indefinitely.
Well, it's theirs.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
does it make you feel any better that 50 years from now, your $10 won't even be enough to buy cat food?
I totally understand where you're coming from, Spencer. It's that the church didn't just pay for people's education. It took 99.5% of the money and put it in its own pocket.
Yeah. I mean, I see this point for tithing when I think about tithing, the present value of my tithing that I gave was $100. And you don't end up taking the donation of $100. Instead, you end up spending over time. My donation ended up being less than that present value. So you took some of that, and the present value of my donation was not used. Instead, it was taken to the future. And then at some point in the future, maybe my $100 will get used, but it's worth much less in the future. And I wanted my $100 used right then.
Yeah, and I wanted to send a kid to school. I didn't want to put more money into a $100 billion corporation.
Understood. Yeah. I mean, I think that it sounds like they could have done better at communicating it. Right there, it explains it pretty well, I do think.
It does, except for that first sentence, which seems to be almost intentionally confusing.
Yes.
Because we know it's an endowment, but look at that very first sentence. All money donated to the fund is used to provide educational loans, period.
In an indirect way. Asterisk, small print. I get it. Yeah.
Isn't that a strange thing to put there? Even though I know are they going to clarify it or contradict it in the second two things? I don't know.
It's double speak, isn't it?
I mean, I'm not reading it as double speak, but I can understand why somebody would. Like, I think that what they're trying to say there is that it's earmarked for educational loans. It's saying all the money that you're donating is going for the perpetual education fund. We're not going to take it and then put it into the tithing fund or the humanitarian fund or the building fund, the missionary fund, whatever. But it is, so somebody said it's all about transparency. This is the church's problem, right? So like the church could be more forthcoming and more transparent and more understandable in terms of its communication about finances, and it just chooses not to be. So I don't necessarily think that even if this is just a misunderstanding or a misreading, it's the church's fault. They could have done whatever to make it clear.
Well, I'm just glad they put this important information in big bold print at the top of the document.
Yeah, instead of at the very end where no one probably read the whole thing.
Yeah, right. That's true.
How much stuff is on top of that, Bill?
Oh yeah, here, let's go up. It's the very last thing, by the way.
It's a big part of transparency that sometimes faithful members tend to forget. It's not about whether it's there. It's about whether it's easily accessible. So people have argued that
they started off with a phrase that's easily understood to mean something different.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm glad you found that, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, here's another misconception for you, Spencer, that the LDS Church could end world hunger.
So this is for all of the critics, if there are anybody still watching. I think that this happens a lot, right? On Facebook or whatever. It's like the church could end world hunger tomorrow if it wanted to, but it chooses not to. And the truth is that based on every estimate that I've seen and that the Widows Mite team has tried to aggregate, the church does not have enough money to end world hunger. And if it did have enough money, there would still be immense geopolitical barriers in getting that money and getting the infrastructure required to then make that happen. It is a whole different cost as well. And so the statistics suggest there are different estimates, but it would require something like 125 billion per year. Or in one recent study claimed that it would take 33 billion per year invested in global self-help programs over the period of multiple, like tens and tens of years. So it's just, it's not close. Okay. So, but they could do more. So for example, we know that the estimates are that around 1 in 10 people go in the world go hungry every day. So that's the immensity of the issue. 800 million people going hungry every single day. And so what the church could do is they could feed roughly, what was the number here? I think that it was 30 million per day, every day into perpetuity. It could feed 30 million people with just the 4.25% being pulled out. So that is a lot. But I don't think that the statistics suggest in any way, shape, or form that the church could end world hunger. So if you do see somebody claim this, just say, oh no, the Widow's Mite actually did this analysis. It actually couldn't.
Very good. Thank you for correcting that.
And this just shows you that like the Widow's Mite team is not out to just be only antagonistic against the church, right? So this is a misconception on the antagonistic side usually. Another misconception.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, here's another misconception. Missionary hours are counted in charitable aid. This question was asked earlier.
Yep. This is another one that often the critics will provide. This was confusing even to the Widow's Mite team. So to be fair, like I understand where the misconception comes from. Most of these misconceptions come because the church is just not being transparent, right? But in 2019, the LDS Church's charity report had this metric called total assistance, and it included the cash value of volunteer hours, including some missionary service hours. But since then, the charitable service, like the $1 billion amount that they've been reporting, it's not possible, like mathematically. When I talk about the Sudoku, like if we try to insert the missionary hours and the dollar value of service hours, even if it was only like 4 service hours a week or something like that, it doesn't add up. You can't get there based on the number. It would blow way past that number that is reported by the church. So just as a clarification, they're not that $1 billion number does not include it doesn't include the service hours. And so they did report service hours separately. There were 6.2 million hours of service volunteers in the 2023 report. But to what extent, I don't know how they measure that or whatever, but it's not in the figure. So
okay, very good. Good to know. And that's just because there's so many missionaries. If every missionary did 4 hours, it would be so much more than $1 billion.
Correct. Yep. Yeah.
Misconception. The church benefits from unique investment insights. This is God beaming down what stocks to buy and when to sell.
That's right. Yeah. So this one's interesting to me because, if you think about like general, the whole goal of the Ensign Peak Advisors Fund is to earn a return and to grow this puppy bigger, right? So a lot of people might think, okay, well, we don't want members to, the reason why they were hiding the information was because they didn't want members to copy the church or the church's investment strategy. And it turns out that would be a very bad thing to do, to copy the church's investment strategy relative to just sticking it into the S&P 500. Because if you compare the S&P 500 to Ensign Peak's performance over time cumulatively, for a little bit there in 2021, it did outpace the S&P 500. A lot of this was based on like certain strategic portfolio decisions coming off of the pandemic.
And that's the green?
That's the green. So at that point in the green, the church was outperforming the S&P 500 index by, 2.5%, 3% around there. But since then, and for the most part over this period, since 2020 and through 2024, it's now at the point where it's 8% under. It's given up 8% of its return over these last 5 years, compared to if they had just stuck it into an index fund. And so you think about the costs that it takes for these analysts and these investment advisors and these asset managers to not only hide all of the 13F filings over time, but then also to engage in this trading behavior and this portfolio strategy when, number one, If they had just stuck it in the S&P 500 index, they would have earned more. And number two, they wouldn't have faced this dilemma about the 13F filings, because you actually don't have to file a 13F if you're just invested in an index fund. So very interesting.
Oh
So-
my gosh.
So
They would
all
have
of
done
this,
better overall
all of this
by
for
just
basically
investing in
nothing.
an index fund, which just tracks the S&P 500. And are those the 500 top stocks?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason that we know that, first of all, some people, I guess, have pushed back on the Widows Mite team on why the S&P 500 is the benchmark that is used here. And they feel like it's trying to make the church look bad. But number one, the S&P 500 would be a really easy thing for the church to do instead, right? So it's a palatable comparison or alternative, right? But number two, 95% of the stock holdings that the church has in Enzyme Peak is in the top 500 positions. So it's not as though they're not mirroring the S&P 500 index. It's just that the weights that they put on the individual stocks are different than the weights that would be put naturally on the index based on size. And so they're very correlated. So the EP funds are correlated to the S&P over the 5 years. I don't know. So I've heard this from the Widows Mite team. So this hasn't been like put into a report yet or anything like that. But whenever like a new company enters the S&P 500, the Enzyme Peak's portfolio tends to start to weight that company more in their portfolio. And when the S&P 500 has a company that drops out of the S&P 500, then the Enzyme Peak tends to kind of reduce its holdings in that company. Mm-hmm. So it itself is sort of tracking the S&P 500, but it's just these small differences in the weights that are causing this big difference in returns. So if you're a faithful member and you think that, like God's investment fund has some sort of unique insights, the data don't suggest this at all.
Important misconception to clear up. Here's another one. Members cleaning chapels is pointless penny pinching. Is that a misconception?
It is. So this is actually, it costs quite a bit of money if they were to try and use professional cleaners instead of, it's a trade-off that the church has to engage in. So first of all, $200 to $300 million is the estimate for how much it would cost to get professional cleaners for all of its chapels. That's a lot. That's 20 to 30% of the money that's spent on supporting BYU, for example, each year, the $1 billion. So that's a lot of money. And so they're saving a lot of money. It's not just that they're just being misers with the money. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, like they've got a ton of money. It's not that they don't have it, but it is a lot of money. And so, you think about the fact that that they're saving a lot through this, and then also they do get some benefit out of it. So the members, by engaging in this type of behavior, is that they sort of feel some sort of ownership over the building, and they feel like maybe they'll take care of the chapels a little bit better. So I'm not saying that there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but there's more nuance to this than just saying like, well, the church is just being cheap. They're actually saving a lot of money on this. And whether, as a usually charities are known for penny pinching anyway, but this is not one of those cases in Widows Mite opinion.
Okay, very good. Here's another misconception. Almost nothing is known about LDS Church finances.
Yeah, this one bothered some people on the Widows Mite team. So I think it was a fair Mormon conference or something like that? That was, what's this guy's name? I can't remember his name. We talked about
him. On him.
Yeah. Aaron Miller, I think is his name.
I think that's it. I can see his face.
I'm trying to look him up. Okay. Yes. So Aaron Miller, he kind of, I don't know why he said these things. But he acted as though like there's not much that we know. And the only things that we know are that we know that what's in the 13F filings, because that's public. And we know about BYU's spending of $1 billion because it's public. And we know that the church gives $1.3 billion in humanitarian aid because that's given by the church. And we know some things that the general authorities have said. And we know that there's an audit report in general conference. We don't know anything else. He stated this. but that's so off. Like there's so many things out there that like the widow's mite has used. And it's just weird because like he's a business school professor, so you should actually look through the report if you're going to make claims about the widow's mite report. It wouldn't take long to go through the source document and just see that there are about, hundreds of other sources that are not listed. And so it was just, I don't know if it was lazy or just like it was an accidental, slip of the tongue or something.
Well, he said some things that border on the apologetic, hasn't he?
Yeah. So I don't know. It's interesting to me. And then he's an ethics professor, and he kept trying to argue that it was just, it was a weird thing for him to stand up as an ethics professor when he's talking about and justifying the 13F violation of SEC law. So, they broke the law. That seems like
it might be unethical.
Most unethical things are actually legal, right? And so the bar for ethicality is not legality, but for sure this was unethical. So,
okay. Well, thanks for explaining that to us. I'm sorry, Bill.
That's almost like Keith Erickson being a hoax expert.
I know Keith Erickson. He's in the church historians department. He's a hoax expert. It's all around him. He can't see it.
I don't know the reference to that. I'm sorry.
Keith Erickson is the head of the church in the historical archive.
Yeah.
His side hobby, he's actually one of the world's experts on hoaxes. He knows how to tell when something's a hoax and when something's not. He's the guy. He's the guy.
A freaking Mormon.
Yeah.
He works in the history department.
Oh, that's pretty bad.
It's absolutely crazy.
It's a good example.
In a church talk, he lays out. This is a side tangent, but folks will love this. This was an early episode of Mormonism Live. It was Mormonism Live, episode number 8. Keith Erickson, hoax expert and director of the Church History Library. There are articles out there from Keith where he lays out how you know that something's a hoax, and the church fits into every one of his examples of how you discern a hoax from something that's true, and it being a hoax. And he's also manages the history department of the church. So,
yeah. Wow.
None is so blind as he who will not see. Okay. Next slide. We're almost there at the end.
Yep.
Misconception that the LDS temples cost 50 to 100 million each.
Yeah, instead they cost on average around 30 million based on the estimates. These estimates fall fully in line. So there was already an estimate per square foot estimate that Widow's Mite team had provided. And then since then they've kind of gone back as well and kind of checked whether those line up with the actual data that we actually know. So there were certain cases in which the temple costs were actually divulged and known. Either because of like public government documents or old documents from older temples in the church. And it actually lines up pretty well. It's around $1,100 a square foot. Actually, a lot of those older temples cost a lot less even when you adjust for inflation. So if you look at like, these are all adjusted for inflation, but these older temples like Bern, Switzerland even, but Los Angeles was only around $300 per square foot. That's adjusted to today, $24.
Really?
And I think that the reason for that, or the Widow's Mite team kind of has a conjecture there that maybe it's because back then a lot of volunteer hours and donations were probably not accounted for here. So you have member donated goods and labor and maybe even deeper discounts from member contractors than current ones. And so the older temples probably didn't cost as much per square foot, but it does look like the newer ones, as you can see, like the Widow's Mite estimate is kind of right there in the middle at $1,100 per square foot. And that comes out to only 30 million per temple. So again, this goes back to the point of like, how much would it cost to build a temple? How much would it cost to build 1,000 temples, right? 1,000 temples would cost $30 billion.
Is there some place in particular that this misconception is being mentioned?
I think it comes back to this idea that it comes on both sides, right? So people are saying like, look, they're spending all of this money on temples instead of giving to the poor. And it is a lot of money. $30 million is a lot of money. but it's not maybe to what people think, right? So I've seen people say like, oh, they're spending, they've got these $1 billion temples is a common kind of sight I hear. And then from the supporters of the church side, the people that are trying to argue that the church should have all of this money in reserve, they argue the same thing. They'll say, well, the temples cost so much money. And we've got so many temples being built. Think of all the temples that are being announced, and we've got to build all of these things. Those things aren't free. These things are built with the finest materials and all of that. And so they're making the argument that the church needs to have all of this money in order to build all these temples. And neither of these sides of the argument are true. It costs $30 million. It's not, and even like in context of like City Creek Mall, right? It's not that much. The temples they're not spending that much on the temples. So
when you say in the context of City Creek Mall, is that the same
City
amount?
Creek Mall was roughly like $2 billion, right? So if you even juxtapose, so like it's interesting that people think that these temples, maybe it's just because they're so grandiose and that they look like they must cost so much, to the point that if you ask people how much they cost, people might say like 500 million or whatever, but it's not that much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And there's another misconception. Actually, this is a list, I think.
We could probably skip this one. There's a whole report, if you go to Widow's Mite,
okay,
that goes through 9 misconceptions just about the SEC settlement, especially about
this is so important perennially. Can I just go through these real quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
9 common misconceptions about the settlement between the SEC and Ensign Peak and the LDS Church. Number 1, findings in the SEC order represent just one side of the story. No, it doesn't. It's the whole story that both sides agreed to. Number 2, the illegal practices were merely a result of bad legal counsel or lawyers being lawyers. That is a misconception. That's not true. The whole thing was just a paperwork issue, or some forms were filled out incorrectly. I've heard that one a number of times, and that's absolutely not correct. This was all out, planned, premeditated fraud upon the U.S. government in order to keep and when I say fraud, I mean creating all these 13F companies and doing all the stuff they had to do in order to put this into effect. This wasn't a mistake. This was very, very detailed and well thought out and planned hoax. Okay, I'll say hoax instead of fraud there. The relevant laws are confusing with a lot of gray area. No, they're not. They're 101. This is very basic stuff. Everybody who does this knows about this. This is like renewing your bar license, okay? This is like renewing your driving license. This is like paying your income tax. Everybody who does this knows that you've got to do it, and it's very easy to do. And
the church doesn't have to pay taxes, though, so maybe that's why.
I'm sorry. Good point.
Yeah.
Most damning, the guy who's in charge of EPA during this entire period, Roger Clark, was also running his own private investment fund. In his private investment fund, he filed the 13Fs quarterly every year that he's the director or the manager of the EPA fund. When he's doing it for his private company, he does it all right and according to the law. When he's doing it as the head of EPA, no, it's all violating the law. So that shows you the difference, okay? It's not just confusing with a lot of gray area. Number 5, there was, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
No. I was just going to say, why are we going into this, RFM? The church has stated, we affirm our commitment to comply with the law, regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. I don't know why we're doing this. The matter's closed. There's no need to lay out all the mistakes the church has made.
Can you imagine how bad this must look for the church to want it to be closed? For the church to be so supercilious and just think they're in charge of what everybody can talk about and can't talk about? Oh my gosh, the hubris. That's the hubris that got him to do this kind of crap in the first place. They've learned nothing. So I don't expect that they've learned anything or that they're going to change, or they've now suddenly developed this newfound commitment to following the law. So use of shell companies is a common practice for large investment funds. That's a lie. And it's based upon a misperception because some people do use, shell companies. But you can't use them this way, not and follow the law. There are legal ways to use shell companies, and there are illegal ways to use shell companies. And the church found the illegal ways to use the shell companies. Let me know if I'm getting anything wrong here, Spencer.
No, that's right. Yeah. Usually
Okay.
shell companies are used for like M&As and things like that. So yeah.
M&M?
Sorry, mergers and acquisitions.
That's what I thought.
Things like that. Yeah.
Okay. What Ensign Peak and the church did was a victimless crime. Victimless crime. Yeah, we've heard that. No, it's not a victimless crime unless you think the Great Depression was a victimless historical event, because that's what this whole thing is about and responding to was the causes of the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929. And this was put into effect that everybody has to lay their cards on the table. If you got over 100 million invested in the US stock market, and you got to file these and let the feds know what it is you have and what you control so that it doesn't happen again. Does that sound like a good idea? Does that sound like a victimless crime? No. Okay. The 5 million civil penalty was like a speeding ticket or a parking ticket. Once again, no. Quit lying out there. The $5 million was many times more than the maximum fine that has ever been levied against any company for 13F violations. I've got that right, don't I?
Yeah.
I do.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And finally, Ensign Peak immediately began to comply with the law once the SEC raised objections. BSU did. There were at least, was it 2 years that went by? How many quarters went by where they still didn't file their freaking 13Fs? You know the answer to that, Spencer?
I think that when they raised objections, no. So the first time that they actually started filing was the quarter after the whistleblower report came out. And I believe that the SEC had started its investigation the summer before.
When was the first time that Ensign Peak filed a 13F in its own name?
First quarter of 2020, I believe.
Okay.
Or
I think that,
or it might have been the last quarter of 2019, but then it's submitted 45 days later. But yeah.
so I think that's what this may have to do with as well.
Right.
So no, they did not. Ensign Peak did not immediately begin to comply with the law once the SEC
right.
raised objections.
Yeah.
And by the way, they had 2 internal audits that happened that red flagged these issues for the church leaders and said, this is against the law, and the SEC is going to have a problem with this, which means you're going to have a problem with the SEC. And that happened not once, but twice on 2 different internal church audits years before this. And they still continue to do it. Do I have that right, Spencer?
Man, you're killing it. I shouldn't even be here, RFM. You should just be doing all this.
No. You should be here. I'm sorry. This is
great. No, this is awesome.
My favorite card in the deck. Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to just pass it by. But now he says, we consider each of these misconceptions in context of available facts and data at, and then you can click the link there and you can find out in more detail. All right.
I will also, if you have any ideas for other misconceptions that you see or you think they're misconceptions and maybe they're not, and you'd like to know, shoot Widows Mite an email, and maybe there will be more that we could add to this. Because I do like this misconceptions thing, this like fact checking. I think this is a cool part of what they're doing.
The fact that they did this, that they did all of this in order to keep the members from knowing how much money the church had, because as Roger Clark said, and it's quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the leaders were worried that members might not think that they had to pay as much tithing if they knew how much money the church had. And that's just in the US stock market.
Yeah.
This is bad stuff. And if I had not become thoroughly disaffected from the LDS Church prior to this would have done it.
Yeah. It's only something you do if you're kind of ashamed, right? Of what you're hiding, right? Yeah.
Yes. And then you don't want anybody else to talk about it anymore. So, okay, you kids, no more talking about this. We consider the matter closed, your mom and I.
Yeah.
Now there's the temple that happened almost a year ago, the Kirtland Temple purchase.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what more there is to say about this, except for this was included within the estimate, 192.5 million to buy a bunch of stuff from our LDS Church, including the Kirtland Temple. And this is considered within the estimate for future projections, a one-time expense. And so that's like part of like the complexity of this estimate is of just all of the widows what they're doing. They have to figure out what are permanent expenses versus transitory, and what kind of things are expected to persist over time. But this is one of the things that a major purchase this last year.
Okay. And then they'll have some amount that they have for maintenance and upkeep, but it'll be a lot less than the purchase price ongoing.
Correct. Yeah.
Which means they'll have a lot more money available for humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
Reported donations indicate the net attrition in members who tithe. I think this is a very important slide. Can you explain?
This is really important. I think this is the last slide too. So tithing went up so first of all, there are 5 countries where it's required for charities or religions to provide some reporting of donations that are made. And it depends on the country. I think UK, you have to specifically report tithing. And then at other ones, it's just like total donations from members. So the tithing went up in almost all of these countries, right? So in UK, it was less than a percent. But on a raw basis, the tithing went up between 2016 and 2023 in these countries, which on its face might suggest that maybe membership is going up because tithing's going up. But during that time, wage inflation also went up. And so if you're earning more as a wage earner, your 10% should be more, right? And so because wage inflation went up by more than the actual raw tithing amount, what that implies is that in these countries, the active members that are tithing, or at least tithing, if you want to call it the tithing participation rate, or the reflection of faith based on tithes, went down by anywhere between 4 and 16% over that period. So 2016 to 2023 across those 5 countries. So Australia what's implied by those numbers is that tithing didn't go up enough to cover what we would expect it to go up by based on just wage inflation, suggesting that active membership went down by 4%. In the UK, 6%. In Canada, 16%. In the Netherlands, 12%. And in New Zealand, 10% over 7 years. That's a pretty big attrition. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those members aren't going to church anymore. It might mean that people are just paying less in tithing than they used to. But you could just call it like the tithing participation rate, or the temple worthiness rate, because you have to be a full tithe payer, right? So
what do you make, Spencer, of the church's claim that it's as strong as it's ever been in terms of, because Quentin Cook, when he said that back in whatever it was, 2000 and I'm going to say 2010, but I don't know when it was, he was speaking directly about people who leave and excommunications. And then just in the last year, the church has claimed that missionary numbers are as high as they've been in a long time, that the church is as strong as it's been in a long time, that people are actually showing up to programs and showing up to church, and converts are high again. And in light of the data that the Widow's Mite has pointed out here and in several other places, which seems to clearly indicate that there's a loss of something, whether it's loss of activity, a loss of members in total, a loss of tithing, everywhere where we can see an indicator, there seems to be a negative, and yet the church seems to be claiming that it's as strong as it's ever been. Your thoughts on what maybe is going on there, or whether there really is growth, and we're just seeing, just by chance, the coincidence, the 5 countries that have to report are sadly the 5 countries that are losing members. And your thoughts?
I do think the U.S. would probably mirror Canada.
Yep.
In terms of its general activity. Globally, if you go to third world countries, it does seem as though there is growth that's occurring. It probably just depends on the metric. And so if I'm an analyst or if I'm an accountant and I'm investing in a firm, like a for-profit firm, oftentimes what we would say is it really matters what measure you're using and whether it's a good measure for a good proxy for the construct you're trying to represent. And so when the church says they're stronger than ever, I guess I would follow up and say, like, what's your measure for strength of the church? Because you can use temples, but temples don't necessarily reflect the strength of the church. It reflects the willingness to spend money on buildings. You could say that it's the number of people that have been enrolled at BYU, but that's a number that's manipulable because you could just open up more enrollments. You could, so you could say that it's the ward buildings, the number of wards, but you could manipulate how many people go to a ward. And I'm not saying that they're doing those things. I'm just saying that those are unreliable metrics to use. And so then it becomes difficult because if you don't get reliable metrics from the source, you have to go to the other metrics that are available, which are metrics like these, which have their own flaws, but at the very least, they're not coming from the source where there's an incentive to provide misleading metrics, right? So I guess my short answer is I don't know. But the church doesn't appear to want to give me a good enough metric for me to know. Does that make sense? And if the church isn't willing to give me a clear metric for me to know, it suggests, based on disclosure theory, that it isn't, right? Otherwise, it would give me a good measure.
Sure. They always like people to know good news. We all do.
Right. Exactly.
It's the bad news we hide.
Right.
Or the stuff we're ashamed of, like how much money we have and how we're not spending it on stuff to help other people out very much.
Right. Also, it's kind of a weird thing to just bring up out of nowhere, where it's like, the church isn't shrinking. It just feels as though like, well, why'd you say that? Is the church shrinking?
Mm-hmm. It sounds reactive.
It does.
And then it goes to the appendix with notes to their inflow and outflow estimates, which we will not read here. And also another page full of notes to our inflow and outflow estimates. A lot of notes, a lot of estimates, a lot of research, a lot of data being crunched there by some really brilliant minds to figure this stuff out. And there's the last page. Okay. So do we have any people? Thank you for taking us through that, Spencer.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry that it took so long. I did hope that people were...
This was great. This was the best 2 hours and 22 minutes I've ever spent.
Okay.
All right. So we do have our 3 calls in the queue. So let me grab the first one. And caller, what's the name?
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, how are you doing tonight? Welcome to Mormonism Live.
Oh, it is such a pleasure. First off, Spencer and the team. I'm really grateful for this.
Yeah.
For Widow's Mite. Thank you. I'm really grateful for the work that you guys do, just because I personally find this stuff endlessly fascinating, and I think it conceptualizes what the church really stands for in a materialistic way. So you guys had previously mentioned how difficult it is to describe how much money the church has. So I wanted to briefly tell you a little story to help us understand that. I work vaguely in the financial sector, and so I'm pretty familiar with Fortune 50 companies. So when we look at a large company, the world's largest company for market cap, that's of course Apple. We're all familiar with Apple. Back in 2013, they had $137 billion of cash on hand. Of course, when a large company like that, you think of Apple, you think of innovation. They're going to use all that money to do research and development, to invest in the future. But they were sued by their shareholders at the time because they weren't giving that money back to shareholders. They're like, you're sitting on all this cash, essentially a company's savings account. You're not giving it back to the shareholders. And I think it's really fascinating. I don't know how much technically the church's money qualifies for the financial technical term of cash on hand. But as members, we are essentially the church's shareholders. And this idea that we are not getting a return, or that the members are not even asking for a return, I find really fascinating. And presumably the reason why the church has garnered so much wealth over the decades is because I kind of think of it as their desert industry mentality, that they historically and institutionally are penny pinchers. Hence everyone has to clean their own buildings. Hence the wards don't have any money for themselves. And I wonder how much previously you had mentioned this idea of what if a prophet or whoever wanted to implement, like, let's become more of a, stop spending money on temples, but instead let's start spending money on members. I wonder how much it would have to be a member asked for thing versus the institution itself changing over time, whether that be a prophet or whoever it is that wants to change the mentality of the church. But I don't know, they've gained so much money. The church at this point is a money-making monster that I don't know how much one individual, or if it would require the members thinking of themselves as shareholders, being cognizant of all this money, of themselves as being the people really in charge of how the money should be spent, and how much it would require to get the church to really change. Sorry, that was a long pontification of, I just like to monologue.
We're glad you called in.
Right. Well, it's a great question. I want to certainly have Spencer give his 2 cents into it. It is complicated, of course, by the fact that this whole tithing thing, which is how they got where they are, is framed as a commandment that you got to do it in order to get to the celestial kingdom. So the shareholders have more obstacles in their way of getting their interest back as shareholders than a normal shareholder would. Spencer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was a great example by Brooklyn of Apple, because shareholders were worried about Apple sitting on cash, not only because they weren't giving the money back, right? And she mentioned this, but presumably if they're not going to give it back as a dividend, they should use it on innovation. And if they're not using it on innovation and to develop things, it suggests to the shareholders potentially that they're out of ideas, and that they lack vision. And so I don't know that I would say, I think that the church would disagree that we're shareholders, because the church is so contractual in its relationship with everything, right? Covenants and just, agency, and whether we've given up our agency based on these covenants, and just everything just seems so contractual in terms of our relationship with God and within the church. And so contractually, we're not shareholders. We don't have the rights that shareholders do. But we should still be worried when we see the church just sitting on cash, because it does suggest that they're out of ideas. It does suggest that they lack inspiration. It does suggest that they lack vision. And so it's almost that there's a lack of direction. And maybe that is what is required. Maybe there's some prophet that needs to come through and has some vision about where to move forward. Yeah, vision is maybe a double meaning of vision, but right. Yeah.
Back in the 70s, they couldn't quote that verse enough from the Bible, where there is no vision, the people perish.
Mm-hmm. And so what would they do if they don't have a vision, if they don't have a model that is unique? It makes sense that they would then default to the shareholder wealth maximization model that they're used to, because they're business people and lawyers and exist in this, very pro-capitalist American society.
It's hard for me to imagine from where else a new path could come from beyond the members, unless we have like a super altruistic leader of the church that pops up, or within the institute itself, people demanding something more. That how would the future ever change?
Companies. So let's say that you want to get a company to change, and this, Brooklyn, but I guess I'm just speaking to the rest of the audience too. But it's hard to get a company to change. Let's say that you want ExxonMobil to engage in behavior that will limit its environmental damage and oil spills. If you're really mad at ExxonMobil's efforts and behaviors, you might say, well, I'm going to vote with my feet, and that will show them, and I will divest, and I will no longer be an investor for ExxonMobil. That doesn't really work in capital markets, because what's going to happen is you're going to leave, and maybe if you leave with a bunch of people, stock price will go down. But then all the people that don't care about the environment, if there are any, they would just jump in at a low price. And then ExxonMobil is left with shareholders that only care about the bottom line. It's a little bit different for the church, though, because if I vote with my feet and I leave, the congregation, and I don't come on Sunday and I don't pay my tithing, it doesn't give the church any opportunity, or any other person any opportunity for arbitrage. There's no arbitrage opportunity for the members of the church to come in and swoop in and take out an opportunity from someone who left. The church only suffers when people leave the church. They don't benefit in any way, as opposed to a for-profit company. And so at the very least, when you ask, like, what is the path forward, at the very least within like for-profit organizations and capital markets where there are shareholders, that solution is actually, I think, harder than the solution that we have in front of us with the church, because we can leave and there's no recourse for the church to fix that. I don't know if that made sense, but
It does.
Yeah.
There's also a possibility looming out there of a successful lawsuit.
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Thank you, Brooklyn. Thank you for the call.
Thank you. Bye.
Easy. Bye-bye. All right. This might be Guy McDude. So let me check here. Is that right? Guy McDude, are you on the phone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah. Turn down wherever the sound's coming from the show.
Hey, the McDuderino. The McDude
Hello.
above.
Let's see.
Yeah, we can hear ourselves.
Yes.
We can just
So
turn that
my
down.
question. Here, let me turn off my Bluetooth. That's probably causing an issue here.
Yeah, let's do that. All right. Guy McDude, what's on your
All
mind
right.
tonight?
So, my question for Spencer tonight, after sharing all his data points, I'm curious with how efficient the church has become as a humanitarian organization, or at least the arm of the humanitarian organization. Would you personally donate to the humanitarian arm, or would you be more likely to join the class action lawsuits?
Oh, I have to choose between the two.
Yeah,
I would
give me a
I would
why.
join the class
Why?
action lawsuit. I don't even know what class action lawsuit you're talking about, but sign me up. But the reason I wouldn't, I guess maybe let's.
RFM, he'll tell you about it.
Sorry.
He said, "Ask me, I'll tell you about it."
Well, I was just saying, talk.
Okay. I guess I'm kind of out of the loop on a lot of the
I'm
Mormonism
still reeling
stuff.
from the recognition of how little you follow our podcast.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Well, there's your answer, Guy McDude.
I would donate to other organizations, charitable organizations, before the church, in part because the church often with its charitable donations is just acting as a flow through. What I mean by that is a lot of its $1 billion, or a lot of like the 600 million that is humanitarian, is just a cash donation to, let's say, the Red Cross or the World Food Hunger Program, the United Way, things like that. So they're donating the money. So why won't I just cut out the middleman? And to Bill's point from before, they could have my money today. If I give it to the church could sit on it and then decide maybe later to give it away, but I can make some difference now. So I would go to an organization that has a really high rating on Charity Navigator, that is, doing some good that I care about, and that engages in effective altruism. And the church does not check any of those boxes at this point.
So is Charity Navigator a website that contains the names of effective charities?
Yeah, so it rates charities based on whether they give, whether they're transparent with their finances, what their program ratio is, which is not a perfect metric, but it's basically if it's a 90% ratio, it suggests that 90% of your donation goes to the cause. Administrative costs, whether they've been, dealt with any controversy or anything like that. So, yeah.
By the way, Spencer, not only would you go, well, if I donate to the LDS Church, they may not use my money for a long time. The current standard for years and years and years and years is that they won't use it at all. It will literally go into the coffers and never come out. That's the current standard. Hence whatever money's left over, like it's a possibility it may never get used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair.
Thank you, caller. Thanks, Guy McDude.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, I forgot to turn off the call in studio, so there are 2 more calls instead of 1 more call. Are you guys okay with that?
I am.
Good. Yeah.
Spencer's on Eastern time.
Great. So
we've had some crazy calls in the past, so I'm hoping that we get somebody.
Tell us about the crazy calls you remember.
I don't remember. Well, I can't remember. I can't remember the details.
Okay.
Was it
There was
Jamie?
somebody that was like smoking marijuana or something, and it was very clear that they were. I won't go into details. I don't want to like. Yeah.
That was me on Mormonism After Dark. All right. So this might be who's on the line here. It says Ronnie Peterson, but I don't know if that's accurate.
Ronnie Peterson. I'm originally from Salina, Utah.
All right, Salina, Utah. Go ahead, Ronnie Peterson. What's your question about?
Okay, now, well, I've just got a quick comment to make, and I mean, I left the church for a reason at an early age at 14, and it's basically the same concept as enzyme peak. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the concept of what they used to feed you, indoctrinate you. Well, Ron, if we build this stake center like they did in 1976, when I'd already left the church, it was going to cost them $6.7 million. Now, I know that's what it cost because Valley Builders and Gunnison got the bid, and I was working for them. All right? And I'd go and ask the church leader, where's this money going to come from? Oh, tithing and fast offerings, Ron. There wasn't enough people in Salina that could pay for that. Now, my point being is, if it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that stuff doesn't add up. It just doesn't. And so if it doesn't add up to me, and they aren't going to tell me what they're going to really do with it and how they're going to pay for it, well, it's common sense. I left when I was 14. And I'm proud of myself because I haven't even paid any tithing for over 50 years.
We all hate you.
But I I don't care if it's a record. It doesn't matter. It's called common sense, and you need that approach. It's just like you look at Dave Nelson. They didn't need the church begged him to come and work for Enzyme Peak. He was a fund manager in New York. Well, because he found out the corruption, and they wouldn't do nothing about it when he brought it up twice. They throw him under the bus because he gave the information to the Washington Post. Now, the people who started that in 1997 was Gordon B. Hinckley, Paul Eyring, Roger Clark. And if you go look at that, it's all on YouTube, the whole evidence. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. You guys got to understand that once he exposed that, they're going to throw him under the bus because, it's all about power. It's all about money. It's just like what Graham Palmer says. When the church starts getting squeaky and nervous and people start leaving, especially upper echelon, well, they'll use their own relation that won't leave the church to fill in the position. I mean, it's not a church. I mean, if I wanted to know the truth about where something comes from, then you'd have to go clear back to December of 1957. Why? Because I was 2 months old. That's the last time that the church in general conference ever told anything about what their expenses was, their financial statement. You haven't seen it since, and you won't find it. Only then.
Go ahead, Spencer.
I mean, you're right. I think that it is common sense and it requires some skepticism. And the issue I think that a lot of us deal with is that the less sense that it makes, the more valuable the faith is, and the more, praiseworthy your faith is to overcome these types of issues. And so it's almost kind of turned on its head. And when you start to have doubts and stuff about these types of things, you're right. It violates all of the brain power we have, right? It violates every principle that we have in terms of, figuring out whether something's a scam or not. But then it's turned on its head and you're told that this is why you need to have faith. And so then the faith ends up becoming the focus. And I'm commiserating with you, I guess, I suppose. And also I'm jealous that you prioritize common sense over faith at such a young age.
Yeah, that's.
But I do think that might be the difference.
I'm sorry. I was going to say.
No,
It doesn't add up, Spencer. It doesn't add up.
No, I know.
We need a rocket scientist here.
It doesn't balance. That's what we would say as an accountant. Yeah, you're right.
You see, Ronnie, the more batshit crazy something is, the more faith you have to believe it.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's a better way of
what you call it. Yeah, but that's what you call being brainwashed.
I know.
Called brainwashing. It's called you have to stay within this, or I just walked away from it. I didn't care what anybody thought of me. I mean, I used to get in big fights with my mom over it. My dad didn't care, but my mom, and she'd always ask me, says, well, why, Ronnie? Why you don't like the church? I says, it's corrupt. How's it corrupt? Well, all you got to do is go look at the church and what they're doing. How are they going to pay for all that? Salina is a small town. How are you going to pay for all that? And they feed you this line of garbage that, we're going to use fast offerings and your tithing. What? Are you nuts? It doesn't exist.
Well, how do you think they paid for it? Ronnie, how do you think they paid for it?
How do I think they paid for it? Well, we know now. We know now, but we didn't back then.
And how was that?
Okay. 2019 is when you got your answer.
This was 1976, though. Wait a second. You were talking about 1976 and spending $6 million to build a stake center.
Nobody knew. Nobody knew. But
you're saying you know what it wasn't.
Nobody knew where it went. They didn't even think about it.
I'm just trying to understand why it is you're upset about this issue.
Why am I so upset about the issue? Because when the church authorities do the corruption and they break the law and they're not brought to their own court and excommunicated and they're brought to justice, nothing was done.
Are you talking about the SEC thing?
That thing? Yeah.
Well, of course. Of course. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, Ronnie. I was stuck back in 1976 with your story about the
scientist to figure out at 14 years old.
That's when you left.
That's right. Because it didn't add up.
Right.
It didn't add up, but we didn't know where the money was coming from either. But we did in 2019. They've been hiding that stuff all them years.
Well, of course. Well, thank you.
They might have not started. Okay, appreciate it. Yep. You have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Ronnie. I appreciate you calling. My dad was a rocket scientist, just so you know.
All right.
I guess we didn't need him tonight.
The last call is Checo. This might be Chekhov again. Chekhov, is it you again from Peru?
Warp Factor 1.
It is me again, boys.
All right. What's your question for Spencer Anderson and the Widow's Mite?
Yeah. I have one question. Here in South America, we have this program that is called something around the lines of Mormon hands that help. You know, they will dress in
Mormon
yellow.
helping hands.
And
yes.
they will. Yeah. Thank you for that. My question was: is that counted as like charity too? Like, do they count the hours that members go out to the streets to clean? And
So no, in the most recent reports, no, they don't include those service hours. They do provide service hours as a separate metric, and I don't remember what it was, something like 6.7 million hours or something like that of service. But they don't include it in the dollar. They don't turn it into a dollar amount for their charity. Now, they did try to do that in 2019.
Okay,
And
'cause I thought they had.
they had done it in the past, and it doesn't look like they're doing that now.
Oh.
From what I understand. That's my understanding of it. Yeah.
Did they get called out on it?
They did get called out on it. And a lot of so this is another thing, it's just interesting how when somebody pushes them on things and it becomes a big enough issue that the church does pivot. So the Widow's Mite team had a couple of reports where they gave recommendations, soft recommendations of how to actually give an understandable, meaningful sustainability and humanitarian aid report. And a lot of those things did improve the next time. They didn't improve all the way, the way that you would hope for, but anyway. So to answer your question, no, they don't count towards the dollar figure.
Okay, but they did at one
Okay.
time. And mainly it's probably because of the Widow's
did
Mite
it,
calling
yeah.
them out on it that they changed.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the Widow's Mite for that one, but other things that they did where they were just sporadically throwing new metrics out there and not consistently providing comparable metrics. There was a big mess, and there still kind of is with the humanitarian aid reports, but it's better than it used to be. So,
Can you put those pictures back up you had of the yellow vest, Bill?
I actually got out of that, but I can pull it up really quick. Mormon.
Well, if you could, just because one of them says Mormon helping hands, then it's got the logo with the hands, the white hand of Saruman, and then it's got underneath it the name of the church. And I'm just thinking that vest must have been made before the edict came forth that Mormon shall not be used. And if so, I'm wondering how many of these vests they had to replace just to change the name on them.
It's a lot of font on the back, isn't it? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Helping Hands.
Yeah, it goes all the way down onto the Levi's.
By the way, I'll just note here for folks, just as a matter of information. Let me get to it. Where was it? Right here. Charity Navigator. We were talking about this in the private chat there. Mormon Discussion Inc. has a 97% 4-star rating. By the way, the reason we're not 100 is because tax form, if your tax form is not posted on your website, you lose 3 points. But our tax forms are on our website. So we actually have 100% charity rating on charity.
That's right. So go and correct them and they'll fix that.
I will. I've already I just signed up to represent the nonprofit on that page, and we'll get that and have 100%. So that's pretty cool.
Good job, Bill. Thank you. And applause to you. They don't have enough rocket scientists there at Charity Navigator.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Well, thank you.
I had another question, guys. Yeah, sorry. Well, this topic gets me really super mad, and I would like to share also a tiny experience about what happened here, because I got baptized at 8 with my mom on the very same day, and I've been a member of the church for 28 years, right? And I can count with the fingers of one hand the times that I have paid tithing, which in retrospective, it makes me happy, to be honest, you know. But on the other hand, my mother, she's been paying tithing the whole 28 years, like every week, you know, and she fell sick last year and she almost died. And we needed money for surgeries, you know, medicines, treatments, and all that. And so I started making the numbers. And in those 28 years of tithing, she has paid nearly $15,000, you know. And I know that it doesn't sound that big for people in the U.S., but here, she was born in the 50s, only has elementary school. She cleans houses and cooks for a living. So it is a big money for us, you know.
So what happened when you got sick?
What happened is like we had to ask help from family, because what the church did, she was sick for like 2 months, and nobody from church came to visit her, you know. No, just one friend that she has. And after 2 months, the Relief Society president came by for like 10 minutes and then sent some groceries. The total amount of what they sent was like $120, but not more than that, you know. So we had to ask help to our family, you know. Hopefully in this country, you can just make an activity and sell food and people will help you, right? You don't have to get any license. Well, it's South America, you guys know. But that's how we got out of the problem. You know, me and my siblings helped her.
So there wasn't like a check that just showed up in the mail for the exact amount of the surgery?
A check? Well, I don't understand the question.
As a blessing for your mother's faithful tithe paying for 15
Paid her
years.
tithing all of her life.
However long it was, I'm sorry.
Oh, of course not.
Sorry, that's probably a bad.
And Chekhov, the thing that makes me mad
My bad.
is your story, and it's also this other thing that I remember being shocked when the church shifted a bit, but it became in perfect alignment that when it comes to your money going to the church, you are supposed to prioritize that money to the church. It comes off the top, baby, off the top, off the cream.
Yes.
Okay. So you put the church first, everybody else comes second. But when it comes time,
but also,
hang on, Chekhov. I gotta do the punchline. Okay. Here's the big punch.
Okay.
When it comes time that you need some help from the church, you're supposed to go to everybody else in the world for money and for help. Before you go to the church, you go to your family, you go to your friends, you even go to the government. That's the shift they made recently. You even go to the government before you go to the church. So so when the money's going to them, they have the game rigged that you give it to them first. They get priority. And when you need the money, they still have the priority.
That's exactly what I was about to say, because they tell you go to family. If family doesn't help, you go to friends. If friends don't help, you go to the government. And if government doesn't help, then you can come to us. And well, we'll see if we can help, because that's another thing here. Like bishops and all the leaders, they act like the money is theirs, not the church's money. You know, like they're overfilled with the money.
I don't mind the church making it a priority to pay them if they make you a priority when you need help.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and the other question that I had was because before, back in the 90s, at least here, I don't know if it happened the same over there, but here they will have, I think the word I'm looking for is janitors, you know, they get paid to go clean the churches, you know, but now they're making the members clean the churches, of course, for free. You know, I don't know if that happens in the States or.
It did.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
worldwide.
The active Mormons don't have to do enough for the church, including all day Sunday and whatever they have to do on the weekdays, right? When they're signed up or they get signed up, then they have to go in on Saturday morning to clean up the church too.
Yeah. Well, this topic gets me so triggered, man. It's infuriating to me to see this corporation with so much money abusing their members, and they're happy with it. The worst part is they're happy with it. The other day, I was talking to a friend, and I was like telling her, look, the church invests on Lockheed Martin. They invest on Raytheon. You know those companies that make ballistic missiles? And she
my dad was a rocket scientist.
Well,
that's how I know. Oh, you're telling your friend. You're telling your friend this?
I was trying to explain my friend this topic, right? And she was like, well, who cares? The amount of tithing that I pay, it wouldn't like cover for one screw on that missile. And I was like, man, you just don't see it.
Well,
Okay, Spencer, go ahead.
It's a weird perspective, right? Because, you mentioned that your mom didn't pay, that much tithing in the grand scheme of things. And your friend said, she wasn't paying that much tithing. But that's not what Jesus was focused on, right? So that's part of why it's called the widow's mite report. It was the widow's mite. And she gave proportionally more of what she had than, compared to what she had available to her. And that's a lot of widow's mites that the church is just holding on to. A lot of people with situations just like your mom's, where they don't have the funds, the discretionary funds. And they're told that the first step for budgeting and to financial, independence is to pay tithing. And there's never been any evidence that I've seen, reliable evidence that suggests that tithing results in the blessings that are promised by Malachi or whatever the church promises. And so if anybody's listening and they're still paying their tithing and they're worried and they don't know whether they should pay their tithing or not anymore, it's pretty simple. You can just engage in a personal experiment. And if tithing opens the windows of heaven so much that it changes your life because there's a blessing that's so big that you can't receive it, right? That's the kind of the promise. It's sort of like it's using embellishment to say the blessings of tithing are going to be so big, you won't even be able to kind of handle it. Well, what that means is the inverse should also be true. Stop paying your tithing and your life should just fall apart. Just absolutely fall apart. And if it doesn't, if things stay more or less the same, then the promises of tithing aren't real. That's what it comes down to. So prove God.
I mean, I
test God for his promises, see if he's willing to keep his promises. And I'm not speaking to you as much on this, but just related to your point, it's just there just isn't any evidence of this promise. And it's a grand promise. And so put God to the test and see if it works. And my own personal experience and every experience I've seen from others has suggested that it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe Bill can correct me here, but I have read the whole book of Malachi, and according to my understanding, God is talking to the priests because they were putting rotten food on the altar, right? It's not talking.
That's true, but that's not the way the church uses it and promises it to you.
No. Of course. So, they want to blame you. They want to blame the member into paying more. Yeah. Well, those were my questions and my comments, and thank you so much, guys, for. Well, I'll call in the future. Have a good night.
You too.
Thanks, Chekhov.
Thanks Chekhov.
For calling in.
And that's it.
That's cool.
That's it for the calls.
Wow. So if I sign this out in 1 minute and 5 seconds, then we're under 3 minutes. 3 hours, excuse me.
And just before you do, Foundation of Apologetic Information and Research was at 76%. Their charity rating. So just
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. They really need to up their game to keep up with you.
That's right.
Spencer, thank you for coming on. Do you have anything else you'd like to say in 30 seconds?
No, thanks for having me. I've talked enough.
It's getting pretty late where you are.
Yeah, it's fine.
Morning comes early around those parts.
Yeah.
Nothing.
No,
Okay.
I mean, it's late.
I know it's late. We will dismiss you.
I'm not
without
going to
further
belabor it.
argument. Okay. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and staying up late and watching the stars come out. Thank you, Bill, for everything. Thank you at home for watching. And everybody, please join us next Wednesday, 6:20 p.m. Mountain Time for another episode of Mormonism Live.